Title: Surrounded by Idiots. Author: Thomas Erikson. A scene: 12E42F3A 1138-4035 A 4CF40 of 67C 86148. Description: less than P greater than a runaway bestseller in Sweden that has sold more than 1 million copies worldwide. Less than I greater than surrounded by idiots. Less than I greater than shares a simple, revolutionary method of understanding the people around you that will change how you interact with everyone from your coworkers to your spouse. Less than P greater than. Less than P greater than. Author Thomas Erikson explains that there are 4 key behavior types that define how we interact with and perceive the people around us. Understanding someone's pattern of behavior is the key to successful communication. The so-called idiots in our lives are most often simply people who have a different behavior profile and style of communication. Less than P greater than. Less than P greater than. Erikson breaks down the 4 kinds of behavior types in number 8212. Reds, who are dominant and commanding. Yellows, who are social and optimistic. Greens, who are laid back and friendly. And blues, who are analytical and precise, in number 8212. And explains how to identify and interact with each type of person, instead of being bogged down with overly technical image. File equals image 0003.jpg. Image: Surrounded by Idiots by Thomas Erikson. File equals image 0001.jpg. Begin reading. Table of contents. About the author. Copyright page. Thank you for buying this St. Martin's Press ebook. To receive special offers, bonus content, and info on new releases and other great reads, sign up for our newsletters. Image: file equals image 0005.jpg. Image: file equals image 0005.jpg. Or visit us online at us.macmillan.com/newsletter. Sign up for email updates on the author. Click here. The author and publisher have provided this e-book to you for your personal use only. You may not make this e-book publicly available in any way. Copyright infringement is against the law. If you believe the copy of this e-book you are reading infringes on the author's copyright, please notify the publisher at us.macmillanusa.com/piracy. Forward. Many years ago, Bill Bonstetter and his son David developed a revolutionary software system based on the DISC method, a way of describing human communication and classifying behavior, and the method that is used throughout this book. Sadly, Bill has since passed away, but David continues to run their company, T Success Insights, to this day. From its humble origins in rural Iowa, this method of behavior profiling has now been used by businesses and corporations all around the world. It all began with one question. A simple, specific question. Could an agricultural salesperson sell more seeds simply by looking at a farm? As a child growing up in rural Iowa, I watched my father apply the foundational principles of William Moulton Marston's Emotions of Normal People. At the time, my father was focused on buyer profile blending, giving agricultural salespeople the knowledge of Marston's tools to better understand themselves and their farmer customers. I can still recall the earliest days, sitting at a knotty pine table over meals of hot pork tenderloins and roast corn, when my father was working through his observations. Pristine driveways and neat groves. Definitely a blue, new and experimental livestock and buildings. You are looking at a red. Although we were close, our paths were incredibly different. My father, a true entrepreneur and red, yellow in every sense of the phrase, was driven to build consulting firms and agencies that helped salespeople refine their craft. I sought the collegiate path, attending university at the University of Iowa, leaning into my red, blue nature while studying accounting and computer science. I spent my free time in the computer lab, pouring my soul into programs through my fingertips. While I was studying, my father perfected his wizard-like ability to understand people. My father and I always remained close and spoke to each other most weeks, even though we were at different milestones in our lives. While I was studying at the University of Iowa, my father sat me down and asked me about contributing to his venture. He asked, "What if we could couple your ability to develop software with my ability to analyze human behavior?" I was ambitious, hungry for fun coding work, and proceeded to embark on the most exciting journey of my life. Together, we built a software system that would produce reports about human behavior. This was a multiplying factor. Soon we were able to reach more people and reveal a person's potential through 3.5-inch floppy disks and 24-page reports. My father and I built a company, T-Success Insights, in 1984 in Iowa to do just that. Over time, we escaped the frigid winters in the Midwest of the United States, relocated ourselves, our families, and our business to sunny and warm Scottsdale, Arizona. In the late 90s, we began using the web for distribution of our famed assessments. Today, we have a thriving business with distributors all over the world. Up until now, you might have wondered why you are so different. Human behavior is, for the most part, complex and nebulous. In some cases, the people around us are idiotic. Understanding human behavior is a never-ending task, an endless pursuit to know the how, what, and why behind a person's choices. It is both easy and dangerous to categorize someone who behaves differently from you as ignorant, wrong, or even thick-headed. Today's world requires a more sophisticated understanding where you value a person for his or her strengths and weaknesses. My father has since passed on, but the purpose we invoked, to reveal human potential, continues to live on. This book is written about the concepts my father applied in sales trainings and applies them to an even more complex situation, understanding the idiots who surround us all. As you read, I think you will understand the worth of a red, a yellow, a green, and a blue. I hope you will pull away some practical advice in communicating effectively with each type. But the most important lesson that you can walk away with is that the idiots who surround you are, in fact, not idiots at all. Instead, they are individuals worthy of respect, understanding, and being valued. Anyone can use the frameworks outlined in this book to get ahead in the game of life. And look at it this way. If you don't understand and use the principles, you'll continue to be surrounded by idiots. And nobody wants that. David Bonstetter, Chief Executive Officer, T-Success Insights. Introduction: The man who was surrounded by idiots. I was in high school when I first noticed that I got along better with certain people rather than others. It was easy to talk to some of my friends. In any conversation, we always found the right words and everything just flowed smoothly. There were never any conflicts. And we liked one another. With other people, however, everything just went wrong. What I said fell on deaf ears. And I couldn't understand why. Why was speaking to some people so easy, while others were total blockheads? Since I was young, this certainly wasn't something that kept me awake at night. However, I still remember puzzling over why some conversations flowed naturally, while others didn't even start. No matter how I conducted myself, it was just incomprehensible. I began using different methods to test people. I tried to say the same things in similar contexts just to see what reaction I got. Sometimes it actually worked and an interesting discussion developed. On other occasions, nothing happened at all. People just stared at me as if I were from another planet. And sometimes it really felt that way. When we're young, we tend to think of things very simply. Because some people in my circle of friends reacted in a normal way, that meant, of course, that they were automatically the good guys. And so I just assumed there was something wrong with the people who didn't understand me. What other explanation could there possibly be? I was the same all the time. Certain people just had something wrong with them. So I simply began to avoid these weird, difficult people because I didn't understand them. Call it the naivete of youth if you will. But it did give rise to some amusing consequences. In later years, however, all of this changed. Life went on with work, family, and career. And I continued to pigeonhole people into two groups. Good and sensible people and all the rest. The people who didn't seem to understand anything at all. When I was 25 years old, I met with a man who was self-employed. Now in his 60s, Ster had founded his own business and built it up for many years. I was given the task of interviewing him just before a new project was to be implemented. We started talking about how things were functioning in his organization. One of the very first comments Ster made was that he was surrounded by idiots. I remember laughing at the time because I thought it was a joke. But he truly meant what he said. His face turned crimson as he explained to me that the people working in Department A were complete idiots. Every single one of them. In Department B you found only fools who understood nothing at all. And he hadn't even come to Department C yet. They were the worst of all. They were so weird that Ster couldn't fathom how they even made it to work in the mornings. The more I listened to him, the more I realized that there was something very odd about this story. I asked him if he really believed that he was surrounded by idiots. He glared at me and explained that very few of his employees were worth having. Ster had no issue letting his employees know how he felt. He didn't hesitate in the least to call anyone an idiot in front of the whole company. This meant that his employees learned to avoid him. No one dared to have one-to-one meetings with him. He never got to hear bad news because he would often shoot the messenger. At one of the offices, a warning light had even been mounted at the entrance to the building. Discreetly placed above the reception desk. The light went red when he was there and turned green when he was away. Everyone knew about this. Not only staff but even clients would automatically cast a nervous glance at the light to find out what awaited them when they stepped over the threshold. If the light was red, some people would simply turn back at the door, deciding to come back at a more opportune time. As we all know, when you're young you are full of great ideas. So I asked the only question I could think of. Who hired all these idiots? I knew, of course, that he had hired most of them. What was worse was that Ster understood exactly what I had implied. What I implicitly asked was, who is actually the idiot here? Ster threw me out. Later on, I was told that what he really wanted to do was fetch a shotgun and shoot me. This incident got me thinking. Here was a man who would soon retire. He was obviously a proficient entrepreneur, highly respected for his sound knowledge of his particular line of business. But he couldn't handle people. He didn't understand the most critical, complicated resource in an organization: the employees. And anyone he couldn't understand was simply an idiot. Since I was from outside the company, I could easily see how wrong his thinking was. Ster didn't grasp that he always compared people to himself. His definition of idiocy was simply anyone who didn't think or act like him. He used expressions that I also used to use about certain types of people. Arrogant windbags, red tape jackasses, rude bastards, and tedious blockheads. Although I never called people idiots, at least not so they could hear me. I had obvious problems with certain types of people. It was an utterly appalling thought to have to go through life constantly thinking that I was surrounded by people who were impossible to work with. It would make my own potential in life so unbelievably limited. I tried to see myself in the mirror. The decision was easy to make. I didn't want to be like Stir. After a particularly toxic meeting with him and some of his unfortunate colleagues, I sat in the car with a lump in my stomach. The meeting had been a total disaster. Everyone was furious. There and then I decided to learn what is probably the most important knowledge of all: how people function. I would be encountering people for the rest of my life, no matter what my profession was. And it was easy to see that I would benefit by being able to understand them. I immediately began to study how to understand the people who initially seemed so difficult. Why are some people silent? Why do others never stop talking? Why do some people always tell the truth while others never do? Why do some of my colleagues always arrive on time, while others rarely manage to? And even why did I like some people more than others? The insights I gained were fascinating. And I've never been the same since I began this journey. The knowledge I acquired has changed me as a person, as a friend, as a colleague, as a son, as a husband, and as the father of my children. This book is about what is perhaps the world's most widely used method to describe the differences in human communication. This method is called the DISR, an acronym that stands for dominance, inducement, submission, and analytic ability system. These four terms are the primary behavior types, which describe how people see themselves in relationship to their environment. Each of these behavior types is associated with a color: red, yellow, green, and blue. This system is also commonly called the DISC system, where the final letter of the acronym stands for compliance instead of analytic ability. I have used variations of this tool for over 20 years with excellent results. But how do you become really, truly proficient at handling different types of people? There are, of course, various methods. The most common method is to research the matter and learn the basics. But learning the theoretical part doesn't make you a world-class communicator. It's only when you begin using this knowledge that you can develop real and functioning competence in the field. Just like learning to ride a bike. You have get on the bike first, only then do you realize what you need to do. Since I began studying how people function and painstakingly strove to understand the differences in the way we communicate, I've never been the same. I'm not as categorical anymore, judging people just because they are not like me. For many years now, my patience with people who are the complete opposite of me has been far greater. I wouldn't go so far as to say that I never get involved in conflicts. Just as I wouldn't try to convince you that I never lie. But both these things happen very seldom now. I have one thing to thank Stir for. He awakened my interest in the subject. Without him, this book would probably never have been written. What can you do to increase your knowledge about how people relate and communicate? A good start may be to keep reading this book. The whole book, not just the first 3 chapters. With a little luck, in a few minutes you can begin the same journey I began 20 years ago. I promise you will not regret it. One thing to note: to simplify reading this book, I have chosen to use him and he consistently when I refer to examples not associated with any specific person. I know that you have enough imagination to insert the her or she in your thoughts where this may be appropriate. One communication happens on the listener's terms. Does that sound strange? Let me explain. Everything you say to a person is filtered through his frames of reference, biases, and preconceived ideas. What remains is ultimately the message that he understands. For many different reasons, he can interpret what you want to convey in a totally different way than you intended. What is actually understood will, naturally, vary depending on who you are speaking to. But it is very rare that the entire message gets through exactly as you conceived it in your mind. It may feel depressing knowing that you have so little control over what your listener understands. No matter how much sense you would like to knock into the other person's head, there's not that much you can do about it. This is one of the many challenges of communication. You simply can't change how the listener functions. However, most people are aware of and sensitive to how they want to be treated. By adjusting yourself to how other people want to be treated, you become more effective in your communication. Why is this so important? You help other people understand you by creating a secure arena for communication on their terms. Then the listener can use his energy to understand rather than to consciously or unconsciously react to your manner of communicating. All of us need to develop our flexibility and so be able to vary our style of communication, adapting it when we speak to people who are different from us. Here we find another truth. No matter what method you choose to communicate with, as an individual, you will always be in the minority. No matter what kind of behavior you have, the majority of people around you will function differently from you. You can't just base your method of communication on your own preferences. Flexibility and the ability to interpret other people's needs is what characterizes a good communicator. Knowing and understanding another person's style of behavior and method of communication will result in more educated guesses about how a person may possibly react in various situations. This understanding will also dramatically increase your ability to get through to the person in question. No system is perfect. Let me be clear about one important point. This book doesn't claim to be totally comprehensive with respect to how we, as people, communicate with each other. No book can do that. Because the number of signals we constantly transmit to those around us wouldn't fit into any book. Even if we could include body language, the differences between male and female dialogue, cultural differences, and all the other ways to define variations in communication, we wouldn't be able to write everything down. We could add psychological aspects, graphology, age, and astrology and still not get a 100% complete picture. According to the American Journal of Business Education, July-August 2013, more than 50 million assessments have been made using the DISCER tool. And yet, even with all this information, communication remains a fascinating and puzzling topic. People are not Excel spreadsheets. We can't calculate everything. We're way too intricate to be described in full. Even the youngest child is far more intricate than anything that could be conveyed in a book. However, we can avoid the most blatant blunders by understanding the basics of human communication. It's been going on for a while. We see what we do, but we do not see why we do what we do. Thus, we assess and appraise each other through what we see that we do. These words come from the psychoanalyst Carl Jung. Different behavior patterns are what creates dynamism in our lives. When I refer to behavior patterns, I don't just mean how a person acts in a single instance, his actions, but rather the whole set of attitudes, beliefs, and approaches that govern how a person acts. We can recognize ourselves in certain behavior patterns, but other forms of behavior we neither recognize nor understand. Besides, each of us acts differently in different situations, which can be a source of either joy or irritation for those around us. Though individual actions can, of course, be right or wrong. There is really no pattern of behavior that is right or wrong. There is no such thing as proper behavior or incorrect behavior. You are who you are. And there's no point in wondering why. You're fine no matter how you're wired. No matter how you choose to behave. No matter how you are perceived. You are fine. Within reasonable limits. Of course. In a perfect world, it would be easy just to say, I'm a particular kind of person and it's okay because I read it in a book. That's just how I am and this is how I act. Sure, wouldn't it be great not to have to mishandle your own behavior? To always be able to act and behave precisely as you feel at the time? You can do that. You can behave exactly as you wish. All you have to do is find the right situation in which to do so. There are two situations in which you can just be you. The first situation is when you're alone in a room. Then it doesn't matter how you speak or what you do. It doesn't hurt anyone if you scream and swear or if you just want to sit silently and ponder the great mysteries of life or wonder why fashion models always look so mad. In your solitude, you can behave exactly the way you feel. Simple, isn't it? The second situation where you can completely be yourself is when all the other people in the room are exactly like you. What did our mothers teach us? Treat others as you want to be treated. Excellent advice and very well intentioned. And it works, too. As long as everyone is just like you. All you need to do is make a list of all the people you know who believe, think, and act exactly like you in all situations. Now just give them a call and start hanging out. In any other situation, it might be a good idea to understand how you are perceived and to learn how other people function. I don't think I will make headlines by saying that most people you meet aren't like you. Words can have incredible power. But the words we choose and how we use them vary. As you have seen from the title of this book, there are different interpretations of, yes, you got it, words. And when you use the wrong word, well, maybe then you're an idiot. Surrounded by idiots. Or not? What does this actually mean? As I was writing, the following analogy hit me. Behavior patterns are like a toolbox. All types are needed, depending on the occasion. A tool can sometimes be right and sometimes be wrong. A 30-pound sledgehammer is great for tearing down walls. But it's hardly the thing if you want to hang a picture in the foyer. Some people are opposed to the idea of sorting people into different behavior types. Maybe you believe that you shouldn't categorize people in that way. That it's wrong to pigeonhole people. However, everyone does it. Perhaps in another way than I do in this book. But we all register our differences nonetheless. The fact remains that we are different. And in my opinion, pointing that out can be something positive if you do it in the right way. Improperly used, every tool can be harmful. It's more about the person using it than the tool itself. This book is your introduction to human behavior and dialogue. The rest is up to you. Parts of what you are going to read I have gathered from T Success Insights. I would like to take this opportunity to thank Sune Gelberg and Eduard Levitt for so generously sharing both their experience and their training materials. No matter how strange it might seem. In theory, every kind of behavior is normal. Normal behavior is relatively predictable. Every person reacts in a habitual manner in similar situations. But it's impossible to predict every possible reaction before it happens. Is part of a pattern. We often react in consistent patterns. Therefore, we should respect one another's patterns. And understand our own is changeable. We should learn to listen, act, speak openly, and reflect in order to do what is relevant right now. Everyone can adapt, can be observed. We should be able to observe and consider most forms of behavior without being amateur psychologists. Everyone can take note of the people around them. Is understandable. We should be able to understand why people feel and do what they do. Right now, everyone can think about why. Is unique. Despite the conditions that we have in common, each person's behavior is unique to him. Succeed in your own conditions. Is excusable. Dismiss personal jealousy and complaints. Learn to have tolerance and patience, both with yourself and with others. 2. Why are we the way we are? Where does our behavior come from? Why are people so different? Search me. Very briefly, it's a combination of heredity and environment. Even before we're born, the foundations for the behavior patterns we will exhibit in adulthood have been laid. The temperament and character traits we have inherited affect our behavior. A process already begun at the genetic stage. Exactly how this works is still a bone of contention among scientists. But all are in agreement that it does come into play. Not only do we inherit traits from our own parents but also from their parents. Also in varying degrees from other relatives. At some point or other, we have all heard that we speak like or look like an uncle or an aunt. As a child, I resembled my Uncle Bertie. Something to do with my red hair. To explain how this is genetically possible would take a tremendous amount of time. For the moment, let us just establish that this inheritance lays the foundation for our behavioral development. What happens once we are born? In most cases, children are born impulsive, adventurous, without any barriers whatsoever. A child does exactly what he wants. The child says, "No, I don't want to." "Oh, sure I can." He is immersed in the thought that he can manage just about anything at all. This kind of spontaneous and sometimes uncontrolled behavior is, of course, not always what his parents wished for. Then, hey presto, what was once an original pattern of behavior begins to transform, in the best, worst case scenario, into a copy of someone else. How are children influenced? Children learn and develop in multiple ways. But the most common is by imitation. A child mimics what he sees around him. The parent of the same sex often becoming the model for imitation. This is clearly not an exhaustive study on how the process works. As this book is not about how we influence our children. My core values are found deep within me. Values so deeply embedded in my character that it's almost impossible to change them. These are the things I learned from my parents as a child or that I learned in school when I was very young. In my case it was different variations of, study and do well in school, or, fighting is wrong. The latter, for example, means that I've never laid hands on another person. I haven't fought since 3rd grade. And I seem to recall that I lost then. She was really strong. Another important core value is that all people are of equal worth. Because my parents demonstrated this to me during my childhood, I know it is deeply wrong to judge a person based on his or her origin, sex, or color. All of us carry many such core values. We know instinctively what is right and what is not. No one can take these core values away from me. Attitudes and approaches. The next layer is my attitudes, which are not exactly the same thing as core values. Attitudes are things I have formed opinions about based on my own experiences or on conclusions I have drawn from encounters in the latter part of my schooling, high school, college, or my first job. Even experiences later on in life can form attitudes. A relative once told me that she didn't trust salespeople. She's definitely not alone in having strong feelings about salespeople. But in her case it resulted in comical practices. She couldn't buy anything without returning it. A sweater, a sofa, a car. The buying process was endless. Every fact had to be examined and explored. No matter how much research she did beforehand. She always wanted to return her purchases afterwards. Image file equals image 0002.jpg. Once I had observed the pattern. I asked her why she did this. And she explained the reasoning behind her attitude. 85% of all salespeople were swindlers. Explaining that I too was a salesperson had little effect. To this day, I don't know if I belong to the 85% or if I can count myself among the fortunate 15%. The important thing is that an attitude can change. My relative had probably been badly fooled a number of times and therefore learned to distrust salespeople. However, if she had a number of positive experiences, her opinion could change. The results, both my core values and my attitudes, affect how I choose my behavior. Together they form my core behavior. The real person I want to be. My core behavior is how I act in complete freedom, without the influence of any external factors at all. You probably already see the issue here. When are we ever completely free from external influences? When I discuss this question with groups of people in different contexts, we all usually agree, only when we're sleeping. But people are different. Some don't care. They are always themselves because they've never reflected upon how they are perceived. The stronger your self-understanding is, the greater your probability of adapting to the people around you. How do others really perceive me? The people around you most often see your moderated behavior. You interpret a specific situation and make a choice about how to act based on that evaluation. This is the behavior that others around you experience. It's all about the mask you wear to fit into a given situation. We all have several different masks. Having one at work and one at home isn't that unusual. And another one for visiting the in-laws. Perhaps this book is not an advanced course in psychology. But I am content to establish that we interpret situations differently and act accordingly. Consciously or subconsciously, surrounding factors cause me to choose a particular course of action. And this is how we act. Look at this formula. Behavior equals F. P times SF. Behavior is a function of personality and surrounding factors. Behavior is that which we can observe. Personality is what we try to figure out. Surrounding factors are things that we have an influence on. Conclusion. We continually affect one another in some form or other. The trick is to try to figure out what's there, under the surface. And this book is all about behavior. 3. An introduction to the system. At the end of this book you will find a description of the background to how the DISA system emerged. But since you probably want to dive into its most interesting elements, how everything works in practice, you can just read on. Otherwise, you can always go directly to page 228. Image file equals image 0013.jpg. Image file equals image 0006.jpg. As you can see, there are 4 main categories of behavior types, each of which is associated with a color. This book is about how you can recognize them. Quite soon, as you start reading about the different colors, various faces will come to mind. Sometimes, maybe, even your own. About 80% of all people have a combination of 2 colors that dominate their behavior. Approximately 5% have only one color that dominates behavior. The others are dominated by 3 colors. Throughout the book I focus on the single colors individually because they are the fundamental components of a person's behavior. It's like a recipe. We need to understand all the ingredients before we bake the cake. Entirely green behavior, or green in combination with one other color, is the most common. The least common is entirely red behavior, or red behavior in combination with one other color. Image file equals image 0014.jpg. Many people you meet possess qualities that you sometimes wish you had. You may even feel jealous of these people. They easily master things that you struggle with. Maybe you'd like to be more decisive like reds. Or maybe you wish it were easier for you to interact with strangers like yellows. Possibly, you wish that you didn't stress so much. That you could just take it easy like greens do. And perhaps you wish that you could keep your schedule in better order. Something that's natural for blues. Naturally, it works the other way as well. You are going to read things that will help you realize that you too boss others around a bit too much, just like reds tend to do. Or that you talk way too much. Something that yellows do. It might be that you take things way too easy. Not getting involved in anything. The green's weakness. Or you are always suspicious of everything. Seeing risks everywhere. Just like blues. Here you can learn to see your own pitfalls and how you can take appropriate measures to get around them. No matter what you learn about yourself and others. Take notes, underline things, and engage with the material. 4 Red behavior: how to recognize a real alpha and avoid getting in his way. What should we do? We'll do it my way. Now, this is the behavior type that Hippocrates in his theory of human temperament called choleric. Nowadays you might call a red person bold, ambitious, driven, but also potentially hot-tempered, rash, or dominant. You quickly notice a red person because he doesn't make the slightest effort to conceal who he is. A red person is a dynamic and driven individual. He has goals in life that others may find difficult to even imagine. Since his goals are so highly ambitious, achieving them seems to be impossible. Reds strive forward, always pushing themselves harder, and they almost never give up. Their belief in their own ability is unsurpassed. They carry inside them the firm belief that they can achieve anything if they just work hard enough. People who have lots of red in their behavior are task-oriented extroverts and they enjoy challenges. They make quick decisions and are often comfortable taking the lead and taking risks. A common perception is that reds are natural leaders. These are people who will willingly take command and go to the fore. They are so driven that they will get through despite any obstacle in their path. Their disposition is ideal in competitive situations. It's not unusual for a CEO or a president to have lots of red in his behavior. This form of competition is present in everything reds do. To say that they constantly want to challenge and compete is probably not entirely true. But if a chance of winning something arises, why not? The exact nature of the competition is unimportant. It's the competitive element that keeps reds running on all cylinders. Pell, one of my former neighbors, liked competing so much that he developed entirely new interests just to compete. I like working in the garden. And so I spent quite some time doing so. Pell didn't like gardening. But when he had heard people commenting on my beautiful garden often enough, he finally had enough. He started one project after another, always with a single but very clear objective: to outdo me. He confounded his wife by digging new flower beds, planting a rainbow of unbelievably fabulous plants, and cultivating the lawn to golf course standard. The only thing I needed to do to keep him going was to merely suggest that I would purchase more plants. Then he would go to the local garden center quicker than you could say, "Bad loser." You can also recognize reds by other behavior patterns. Who talks the loudest? Reds. Who goes all out when explaining something? Reds. Who's always the first to answer a question? Reds again. Who, during an otherwise pleasant dinner, makes categorical comments on just about any topic? And who will judge an entire country based on something he saw on television? Reds. Something is always happening in the lives of red people. They can't sit still. Idle time is wasted time. Life is short. Better get going immediately. Do you recognize the type? Always on the go. So step aside. Let's get cracking. Tell me what you really think. Yes. For real, Reds have no problem being blunt. When asked a specific question, they often say exactly what they think. Without any frills. They see no need to wrap things up in a bunch of empty phrases. When a thought pops into their heads, everyone knows it immediately. They have opinions on most things. And they trot their thoughts out quickly and efficiently. A common remark is that Reds are very honest. Because they dare to express their personal truths to people. They don't really understand what the fuss is all about. They've only said things as they are. If you need someone with extra energy, you may want to invite the Red into the team or project group. They fight tirelessly along when others have already given up. If they are determined to succeed, that is, a task that has become humdrum or meaningless could be totally ignored by a Red. I call this phenomenon slog or split. If the task is important enough, a Red will go through fire and water to complete it. If he feels it has no purpose, into the trash it goes. Image file equals image 00021.jpg. Can I win something? In that case, I'm in. So Reds like competing. They appreciate the slight antagonism that is part of being competitive and the glorious moment of winning. They even enjoy winning competitions that probably don't even exist. Except perhaps in their own mind. It can be passing a slow walker on the street, finding the absolutely best parking spot, or dominating the family game of Monopoly. Despite the fact that the purpose of the game is to entertain the kids and none of the other adults are actually competing. For a Red, this is all natural because he sees himself as a winner. Let me give you an example. I once worked for a company where the CEO was Red. He was energetic and efficient. And consequently incredibly dynamic. No meetings were as short and sweet as those run by this CEO. But his weak spot was the competitive element. As a young man he had played soccer. And every spring at this particular workplace they held a soccer tournament. It was very popular, even before he joined the company. Naturally, he had to take part. No other CEO before him had ever done so. But that wasn't the problem. The problem was that as soon as he got out on the field he became a different person. On fire with his competitive drive. He flattened anyone who stood in his way. This continued for a few years until someone had the guts to tell him that he played just a little bit too rough. The game wasn't supposed to be that serious. The CEO didn't understand. He grabbed the latest flyer for the game and pointed out that it was called a soccer tournament. Tournaments are competitions. And if you compete you are in it to win. Simple. He competed in traffic. On the soccer field. In business. No area was too insignificant not to become a competition. He even raced to see how quickly he could finish reading a book. What others do for relaxation he transformed into a competition. 100 pages an hour was a reasonable pace. His wife had even banned him from playing a memory card game with his children, who were 5 and 6 years old. Since they had better memories than he did, they won most of the time. And in his frustration he intimidated them. Before you conclude that this guy sounds rather unsympathetic, we need to look at his intentions. This kind of intensive and competitive behavior often upsets other people because they think it is all about dominating and suppressing others. Nothing could be further from the truth. His intentions were almost never malicious. He just wanted to win. This is one of the greatest challenges for Reds. It's not uncommon that other people feel irritated or intimidated by them because they're such powerful personalities. Later on in this book, I will share some simple ways that you can deal with these individuals. Time is money, quick, is synonymous with Good, for reds. If you are in a meeting and suddenly notice that one of the other participants is devoting his time to something completely different, it may well be a red who has lost interest. If you look closer, you will realize that his thoughts are elsewhere, on the next step in the process being discussed. For example, because reds are quick thinkers, they move on long before everyone else. Few things annoy reds more than sluggishness. If a meeting or a discussion drags on, he may interrupt and ask if it's really necessary to prolong the issue. We've already discussed this for 20 minutes. Get it together. It's only a few million in investments. How hard can it be? Quote, if you think about it, they're often right. When other people may find it difficult to make a decision, reds are prepared to make quick decisions in order to keep things moving. With a red on the team, nothing will be discussed ad infinitum. After all, it's always better to do something rather than nothing. Right? The advantage is obvious. We're talking about people who never waste time on anything that doesn't move forward. As soon as a task becomes unclear or is taking too long, a red will ensure that the momentum is maintained and spur things along. Chop chop. Done in double time. About 15 years ago, I began working for a small consulting company with about a dozen employees. It was a polished organization with a great spirit of entrepreneurship and excellent momentum in business dealings. One of the reasons why they were so efficient was because the founder of the company was a red. Nothing could move too quickly for BORN. No meeting took longer than was absolutely necessary. In my second or third week in the new job, I was sitting in a traffic jam when my cell phone rang. I looked at the display and saw that it was BORN. I answered the way I'd been instructed to when I started at the company, with a greeting, my name, and the company name. Impatiently he interrupted me and spat out his question. Were you looking for me? Quote, no, I replied, and took a deep breath, ready to say something else. I didn't get the chance. Okay, he said, and hung up. 8 seconds. Unpleasant? Well, at the time we didn't really know each other. However, I must admit that the whole episode had me worried a little. At least on that occasion. Only 3 weeks at the company and the big chief himself calls. And sounding irritated. When we'd gotten to know each other, and I learned that BORN was red, I asked him why he was so abrupt on the phone. Of course he didn't even remember the call. But he said he was probably just trying to find out if I was looking for him. When he learned I wasn't, there was no further need to talk. Wasting time on polite flowery phrases or drawn-out farewells wasn't for him. But at the same time, here was a person with a capacity to work far more than normal. BJORN managed to do more in an average working day than most people. He still has an exceptional ability to make the most of any free time. If he has a gap of 5 minutes in his schedule, he manages to squeeze in an email, a phone call, and go through some meeting minutes. From the outside, this may seem like an unnecessary pursuit of efficiency. But a red detests inactivity. Things must happen. Add to this a sense of constant urgency, and a great deal will get done. The sky's the limit. Or is it? For a red, a realistic budget is a budget for cowards. If we don't push ourselves to the breaking point, we haven't tried hard enough. Reds love difficult tasks, so their level of ambition is usually boundless. The ability to manage difficult situations and challenges is the defining attribute of red behavior. When a person with red traits sets his goals, several things happen. First, he wants to know how well a specific task under the most favorable conditions could be performed. If all 19 parameters were met and we all gave it a little extra effort, the results would be phenomenal. This means that anything below that impossible level of excellence is boring. Because there's at least a remote possibility of that result being achieved. Nothing is impossible. The impossible just takes a little longer. More than likely it was a Red who came up with that expression. Naturally, it's also about the type of project. It's not enough just to set an impossible sales budget. If a Red doesn't like sales, he'll ignore the budget. Since he prefers to make all the decisions himself, he probably won't be fooled into doing something he doesn't feel like doing. Reds set higher demands on themselves than any of the other colors would. And they are always prepared to work hard. I wouldn't go so far as to say that no other color works as hard as Reds do. But I would venture to say that a Red would give anyone a run for his money. Ambition, which is intrinsic to Reds, shouldn't be confused with a lust for power. Reds have no problem taking positions of power, since they are fearless. Expressions like, "It's lonely and windy at the top," don't scare them. But for a Red, power is not an end in itself. It does, however, come in handy for those who like to make their own decisions and avoid having to wait for others. A Red can, in fact, be quite unassuming. It's true that he has a strong ego. But status and prestige don't have the same importance as with other colors. The reason is simple. A Red usually doesn't care what others think. He's not here for their sake. He's here for his own. Let me tell you how things really are. A Red gives everything he's got. When he has an opinion about something, or if he wants the rest of us to agree with him, he pulls out all the stops. Once, I was in a meeting with a large number of people who didn't know one another that well. It was a gathering of consultants who were meeting to discuss a potential collaboration. It was in the middle of a recession, and we were all concerned about the lack of direction. While we were waiting for the chairperson to arrive, we chatted a little about everything. At one end of the table sat Elizabeth, who had strong opinions about everything. In an unequivocal voice, she suddenly stated that the company was still expected to earn over $50 million a week. Despite the recession, about 15 consultants, all highly trained, reflective, and intelligent people, nodded in agreement. Just imagine, $50 million per week. While Elizabeth expanded on how the situation ought to be resolved in the consulting world, I began thinking about the figures a little bit. Not knowing where these figures came from, I remained silent. It could be true. It could also be far-fetched. I honestly didn't know. While waiting for the meeting to begin officially, I started calculating how much $50 million per week would be per year. I didn't have enough paper. After the meeting, I got the answer to my speculations. I was in a taxi on my way to my next meeting when the driver turned on the radio. In the news, it was announced that the company in question was expected to earn between $2 and $2.5 million per week. I realized that Elizabeth had gotten the information from the news. I also understood that $2 or $2.5 million per week was far more realistic than the $50 million that she had referred to. But wait a minute. A little reconciliation with reality is needed here. Why didn't anyone react? No one in the room lifted a finger or called her information into question. Why? Because she sounded so convincing. Her facial expression was definite. Her countenance was determined. And her voice did not quiver in the least when she presented her figures. That's the way Reds function. When they believe something, they let people know that this is the only truth that exists. Now maybe there are some sticklers for detail who might claim that this is deceptive. Since we now know that the company earned $2.5 million a week and not roughly $50 million. But I'm convinced that Elizabeth really believed what she said. She had things turned around. No doubt about that. And she was certainly not interested in details. But my point is that by sounding utterly confident when she declared that the company was earning 6 months' revenue per week, we all fell for it. Oh, in the words of a good friend of mine, there are 2 ways to do this: my way and the wrong way. Only dead fish go with the flow. Reds are both groundbreaking and strong-willed. Why not also add results-oriented and decisive when we're at it? For Reds, it's not sufficient to do things like everyone else does. And just because it's tough doesn't mean we should avoid doing it. Reds aren't afraid to make decisions when everyone else hesitates, thinking and weighing the risks. A Red makes the controversial decision. A Red's determination is usually unyielding. Once he's decided, then it's full steam ahead. Their fearlessness dares them to tackle things that make others hesitate. This is usually evident when things get rough, and they are undaunted by tough choices or tricky decisions. It is no coincidence that many entrepreneurs are Reds, setting up new businesses, especially if they are based on completely new business concepts, is, in our current economy, not for the faint of heart. It's not a bad thing to have a force of nature in the driver's seat. It takes a strong mind to move things forward. Someone who understands that risks that are part of everyday life and that everything boils down to hard work from morning to night. For many years, Reds understand this from the beginning and are in no way intimidated by it. Do you need someone to pursue a problem in your apartment complex? Maybe you've gotten on the wrong side of your landlord, who says that there is absolutely nothing wrong with your heat. Or maybe the contractor who repaired the roof and installed the new elevators was negligent and won't take responsibility for it. Anytime you try to get things straightened out, you've been brought to standstill by a barricade of unanswered calls and info at addresses. You are just about to give up when you suddenly remember the guy on the second floor living above you. Isn't he kind of Red? Wasn't he the one who dared to go against the super at the last meeting and get the trash policy changed? Yes, that's the guy. Throw the guy from the second floor into the process. And then you'll see things begin to happen. You might have to motivate him a little, explaining that he has a lot to gain from it himself. But he will make things happen. He'll subdue the landlord and get the contractor in line. And he won't lose any sleep just because someone got angry with him in the process. Generally speaking, a Red's strengths are very powerful. They are extremely clear in their communication. And you don't have to look far to identify Red behavior. Of course, over the years many Reds learn to restrain themselves somewhat. But it doesn't usually last very long. They'll be back to full throttle. And all that entails. It wasn't better before. Onward and upward. A Red doesn't try to stick to his original point of view when he realizes that a better solution exists. He is a quick thinker and has no problem shifting his ground at short notice. One of the advantages of this is that he doesn't reject other people's ideas if he has none himself. It's worth looking into anything that can propel development forward. Sometimes decisions can come a little bit too quickly. But the will to constantly change creates a strong dynamism and flexibility. If anything has been static for a long time, maybe a few weeks, he will turn things up a notch. Some people may find this stressful. But when you ask a Red why he changed something that was actually working, the answer could well be, because I could. Naturally, there are also downsides. Reds get bored with the status quo quickly and so they change it. The people around them have no idea what will happen next. When greens and blues have just gotten used to the new organization and think they have finally grasped how things are supposed to work, well, a Red will have already outlined the next step. Conclusions on Red behavior. So what do you think? Do you know any reds? Do you have any around you? If you want to get to know some famous red people, consider Steve Jobs, FDR, Venus Williams, or Margaret Thatcher. There's also Barack Obama and Mother Teresa. Oh yes, it's true. If you consider Mother Teresa's deeds, the strength she needed and whom she had to deal with, the world's foremost leaders, to achieve what she did, then you'll realize that she was extremely determined and forceful. A typical red profile. 5 Yellow behavior: how to recognize someone whose head is in the clouds and get him back to reality. Again, that sounds fun. Let me do it. In the Hippocratic world, we have now come to the sanguine person. What other words can be used to describe him? Optimistic and cheerful. A person with a bright outlook on life. The thesaurus even suggests the epithet a man of possibilities. How about that? It is, in fact, an excellent description of yellow behavior. These are people who live to live, always finding opportunities for enjoyment. Life is a banquet, and yellows will see to it that they savor every bite. They are driven by merriment and laughter. And why not? The sun is always shining somewhere. Do you know anyone who sees sunshine where others see dark clouds? Have you met anyone who can laugh even though he hasn't had any good news for months? Then you've met a yellow. Have you been at a party and wondered why everyone flocks around a particular person? Man or woman? Well, in the center of the circle there's a yellow, entertaining anyone who wants to laugh. Yellows make sure that the atmosphere is at its zenith so that every event becomes a marvelous party. When something is no longer fun, they move on to another place where the atmosphere is better. Recognizing a yellow is easy. He's the one who's talking all the time. He's the one who gives answers rather than asking questions. Often answering questions that no one has even asked. He answers a question by telling a story that may or may not have anything to do with the issue. But it really doesn't matter, because he will put you in a cheerful mood. Besides, his unshakably positive attitude also makes it impossible for you to feel upset for long. I would even go so far as to argue that yellows are more popular than other colors. How can I say that? Look for yourself. They entertain, put people in a good mood, and fun things always happen around them. They know how to capture everyone's attention and how to keep it. They make us feel important. They are just nice to be around. They are also very typically touchy-feely people. Like reds, yellows are very willing to make quick decisions. But they can rarely explain why using rational reasoning. A more likely response would be, "It just felt right." And sure, gut feelings shouldn't be underestimated. Studies have shown that gut feelings are right more often than we think. But that's not the kind of gut feeling we're talking about here. Yellows often make decisions that are based on feelings simply because no thought was ever involved. I have a sister who is yellow. Marita is so easygoing in her manner that I have never heard anyone utter a single negative word about her. Never. I may be biased, but I have never met anyone who doesn't immediately like her. She has an entirely unique ability to connect with every person she meets. Marita always has something entertaining to say. However, some of these things are so peculiar that I sometimes have to ask her what she was thinking when she said them. With a burst of laughter, she usually replies, "Thinking? I wasn't." Quote, "In many ways, it's liberating when I visit her and her husband, Leaf. Their almost incomprehensible ability to see bright spots in everything around them is so delightful that it frees my own easygoing disposition. I am never as happy and exhilarated as when I visit them. For years, I wondered why this was, and have reached the conclusion that yellow behavior is simply contagious. If I say to my sister, It looks like it is going to rain, she simply replies. I can't imagine that. Pointing to the window, I say to her, but look, it's actually raining. It is quite dark out there. We could have thunder before this is over. Sure, she says. But after that the sun will come out. Just wait and see. Then she laughs. Again. While the rain pours outside. She sits on the sofa. Unabashedly having fun. And I, along with everyone else, laugh along because it's impossible to resist. The more the merrier. Your friends are my friends. People with lots of yellow in their behavior are focused on creating relationships. They are outgoing and can be extremely persuasive. They're enthusiastic, excited, and happy to talk about their feelings for others and, not infrequently, for complete strangers. Yellows can talk to anyone. They are not at all shy, perceiving most people they meet as pleasant. They even see strangers in a positive light. They're just friends you haven't met yet. Many people notice that yellows are always smiling and laughing. That's undoubtedly one of a yellow's strengths. Their optimism is invincible. Comments about how everything is going to hell are often met by remarks about, what a beautiful view we have. Quote, just like reds, yellows have lots of energy. They find most things interesting. And yellow individuals are the most curious people you'll ever meet. Everything new is enjoyable. And a great deal of yellow energy is spent finding new ways of doing things. Who gets the most holiday cards? Do you think? Yellows. Most contacts in their cell phone? That's right. Yellows. Most friends on Facebook? You are getting the idea. Yellows. They have friends absolutely everywhere. And they are excellent at keeping in touch with everyone in order to keep up to date. Yellows want to know what's going on. They want to be where it's all happening. And they will make sure to be at every party. Image file equals image 0016.jpg. Isn't it amazing? I just love it to bits. If there is anything that characterizes yellow behavior, it's unlimited optimism and enthusiasm. Few things can keep their good mood away for long. The yellow's entire being is concentrated on one thing: finding opportunities and solutions. In his day, Hippocrates called yellows the sanguine ones. This simply means optimists. Nothing is really a problem. It will all sort itself out. It's neither here nor there that the world just happens to be full of worries and hardships. With their incurably positive outlook on life, yellow individuals give joy to the people around them with their cheerful acclamations and entertaining jokes. I don't know where yellows get their tremendous energy, but it's focused on having fun and devoting themselves to social togetherness. Everyone must be involved. And a yellow will not allow anyone to be gloomy. Mick, a good friend of mine, is yellow, and his life has included more than his fair share of challenges. His wife left him, his children have had problems at school, and on various occasions his employers have gone bankrupt and he has lost his job. I can't even count how many times he's had a car accident. His home has been burgled. Or he has been robbed of expensive items. Sometimes I hardly dare to answer the phone when I see that Mick is calling. To tell the truth, Mick is the most jinxed man I have ever met. But what's so curious about him is that none of this ever seems to bother him. Naturally, he's upset when accidents happen. But he can't stay upset for long periods of time. Inside, he just bubbles along most of the time. I remember one occasion when we were both quite young. He had just bought an old Alfa Romeo. It was a two-seater with 2 doors. Painfully rusty. It was nothing short of a miracle that it even held together. Mick had the car for about a week when he hit a lamppost and couldn't get out on the driver's side. When I heard about the accident, I was worried and called to see if he was okay. His answer? It was fine. I just got out the other door. Quote. The optimistic consultant strikes again since yellow individuals are so positive and cheerful. They spread joy and warmth to those around them. With their uncontrollable optimism, they demolish all opposition quite effectively. Who can be upset when there's someone pointing out the good things all the time? How could anyone fail to be inspired by a person who refuses to see half-empty glasses? Who always sees the positive? One of my customers is a sales director for a pharmaceutical company. Marianne worked her way up in the company via what we call the long route. Her managers and co-workers all agree that she's been so successful simply due to one thing: her amazing ability to inspire those around her. On a number of occasions, I've watched her conduct sales meetings. I consider myself a decent motivator. But when Marianne gets going, you just have to take your hat off to her. Within a couple of minutes, the room is so inspired. If she were to ask the sellers to jump out the window, they'd do it. Even though they are on the 5th floor. She makes everything sound so simple. It's a great idea to jump out the window. We can do this. Let's jump. Quote. And the group jumps after her. With her optimism and bright outlook on life, she is phenomenal at getting people to achieve great feats. Just by closing their eyes to anything negative. With sheer inspiration, she can inflate people's confidence to incredible levels. I once saw her dealing with an irate customer who felt mistreated by her organization. Not a situation most people dream about. It turned out it wasn't a problem for Marianne. By just smiling steadfastly at the customer and refusing to listen to his negative comments, she moved him from an angry face to a gentle smile and finally to boisterous laughter. How could that happen? I don't think that even she could explain the underlying process. It simply came naturally to her. What happens if we turn everything upside down? You won't find anyone more resourceful than a yellow. If there is anything yellows have an aptitude for, it's seeing solutions where others do not. Yellows have the unique ability to twist and turn things. To put it simply, they turn everything upside down and think outside the box. Call it what you want. But their thinking doesn't always follow any set pattern. They move quickly. The yellow's intellect is very fast, which means that it can be difficult to keep up. Sometimes they can even find it difficult to explain their wild ideas. A good friend of mine likes to work on his home. Everything relating to interior design and garden design fascinates him. I suspect that Robin would secretly rather work in design on a full-time basis instead of his actual job. I've seen this for myself. But I've also heard from his wife how he goes about things. He walks around the garden, and she starts counting backwards from 10. On 7. Robin says, "Honey, I have an idea." There are a few reasons for Robin's creativity. It's easy for him to think in images. He can simply see things in front of him long before they even exist, and he has courage. He's not afraid to try new things, or to talk about them. Usually, his mouth works parallel to his mind as he discovers these ideas. I've worked with a yellow who couldn't even cross the street without coming up with a few really thought-provoking business ideas, just by looking around. How does this work? I don't really know. For a long time, we asked him to write down his proposals. You'll learn more about how a yellow would react to that kind of structure when we start talking about weaknesses. Yellows are also helped by the fact that they rarely have any limitations. A yellow dares to go beyond the usual conventions when he's in a creative mode. Normally, of course, structure and hierarchy in a business are a kind of limitation. But yellows are really concerned about such things. In fact, they often don't seem to know that such limitations are there. Need help with new suggestions or ideas? Hunt out the most yellow person you know. Are you stuck in the same way of thinking? Do you need a new perspective on an old problem? Speak to a yellow. You might not be able to use whatever idea scheme they come up with. In fact, realism isn't a factor for a yellow. But one thing can lead to another, and then all of a sudden you have something that works. Selling snow to a penguin with all their energy and optimism. Yellows are very persuasive. It's easy for them to get carried away, seeing opportunities and solutions where others might only see a dead end. It's often said that there is a difference between convincing and persuading. And many yellows cross these boundaries. But what they say sounds so good. With the help of language, they really are masters at winning over people to their side. Regarding language, as I describe in the chapter on body language, page 106, most yellows have a rich and varied way of gesticulating, so that they can convince you not just with their words, but with their entire bodies. But it's not just energy and will. Yellows have a unique way of expressing themselves that sways their listeners. They often use vivid and colorful imagery when they speak, which appeals to all five senses and creates an impression that is felt by the whole body. Without even knowing it, many yellows are skilled rhetoricians. They know instinctively that their ethos, the bearer of the message, is just as important as the message itself. Therefore, they are mindful of getting through to you as an individual, usually by being friendly and shaking your hand, making small personal comments, making you feel important. Many politicians are phenomenal at this. Think of Bill Clinton, for instance. He has the kind of charisma that is naturally present in many yellows. A noticeable interest in another person. The ability to ask exactly the right questions so that others feel that they are important. I know lots of people. All of them. In fact, if yellows aren't allowed to cultivate their relationships, they will slowly wither and die. Okay, this may be somewhat exaggerated. But the very definition of yellow behavior revolves around their ability to build relationships. The yellow traits are inspirational. They inspire those around them. And the best way to achieve this is through building relationships. A yellow knows that by far the most important factor in business, for example, is relationships. If your customer doesn't feel positively about you, it will be difficult to make any headway. Yellows know everyone. They have more acquaintances than everyone else. They like everyone. A yellow doesn't need to know a person very well before calling him his friend. Anyone who doesn't actively dislike them they consider to be a pal. Remember that when reds ask what is going to be done, yellows want to know immediately who will do it. This question is crucial for yellows. If the team or group does not function smoothly, a yellow will not feel well. He needs functioning relationships for him to come into his own. Conclusions on yellow behavior. What do you think? Have you ever met a real yellow? Famous people who exhibit clear yellow traits include Oprah Winfrey, Robin Williams, Ellen DeGeneres, and, to take some fictional examples, Pippin from The Lord of the Rings and Han Solo from Star Wars. 6. Green behavior. Why change is so difficult and how to get around it. How are we going to do this? It's not urgent, right? The green person is the most common. You'll meet him virtually everywhere. What's the easiest way to explain who he is? Well, I would like to describe him as being the average of all the other colors. Please don't interpret that as something negative. Keep in mind what this truly implies. While reds are stressed performance seekers, yellows are creative bon vivant guys, and blues are perfectionist knights of Excel spreadsheets. See pages 13 and 14. Greens are the most balanced. They counterbalance the other more extreme behavioral traits in an elegant way. Hippocrates called them phlegmatic people. The Aztecs called them earth people. Calm, leisurely, and easygoing are some words that could also describe them. It's just a matter of stating the facts. Not everyone can or should be extreme. Otherwise, we would never get anything done. If everyone were a driven leader, there would be no one left to be led. If everyone were an enthusiastic entertainer, there would be no one to amuse. And if everyone were a detail-oriented perfectionist, there wouldn't be anything to keep in order. This means that greens don't stick out in the same way as others do, and they often lend serenity to a situation where reds and yellows start off in top gear. Greens are significantly calmer, and where blues get caught up in details, greens try to feel their way to what is right. If you have a friend who is green, he'll never forget your birthday. He won't begrudge you your successes. And he won't try to take the spotlight off you by reeling off his own stories. He won't try to outdo you. And he will never pester you with new and drastic demands. Nor will he see you as a competitor if you were ever placed in that situation. He won't take command unless he has been told to do so. And he won't. Just a minute, please. You might be thinking, that's just a lot of things he doesn't do. So what does he do? You can't ignore the fact that greens are more passive than others. They're not as driven as reds, not as resourceful as yellows, and not as orderly as blues. This describes most of the population. For this very reason, they are easy to deal with. They let you be yourself. They don't demand much, and they never kick up a fuss unnecessarily. Children with green features are usually described as being little angels. They eat when they're supposed to. They sleep when they're supposed to. They do their homework when they're supposed to. But it's not just that. Greens will not offend people if they can avoid it. They'd rather not offend anyone at all. And they won't talk back if the boss makes a strange decision. At least not to his face. That is, during the coffee break it may be somewhat different. But more on that later. They usually strive to fit in, which makes them more balanced people. They're ideal for calming down confused yellows, for example, and they're excellent at warming up blues, who, on occasion, can indeed be a tad too cold. We often hang out with a family where the husband is yellow and loves to horse around and take center stage. He comes up with amusing games and is more than happy to answer any questions himself. Everyone else is his audience. And he never steps out of the spotlight. His wife is green, calm, composed, and as laid back as can be. When he jumps around and frolics. These are middle-aged people. She sits quietly on the sofa and smiles. She's just as entertained as everyone else by his antics. When I ask her if she ever gets tired of her comical husband, she sometimes replies quietly, "But he's having so much fun." This is a typical green trait. They are very tolerant towards other people's more singular behavior. Is the picture becoming clearer? Greens are the people you might not think about. Most of us. That is, some simple basics. Green people are kindness personified. You can expect a helping hand whenever you need it. They are pronounced relational people who will do everything within their power to save your relationship. And they will invest lifelong. They will keep track of when your birthday is, when your partner's birthday is, when your children's birthdays are, etc. It wouldn't surprise me if they even know when your cat first saw the light of day. It's often said that greens are the best listeners. And this is true. A green will always be more interested in you than in himself. And if perchance he should be interested in himself, he would never dream of showing it. You often find greens in the public sector, where they help others, with no concern for personal gain. They are also pronounced team players. The team, the group, the family, always comes before the individual. And I would even say that societies consisting of greens will always take care of the sick and pay Weak. They will not leave a friend in need. You can call them at any time. They always offer a shoulder to cry on. Change isn't their greatest strength. Even though change isn't completely foreign to them. If you can simply justify the change and give him enough time. Even a green will be prepared to try new things. But a green will remind you that you always know what you have. But you never know what you might end up with. The grass is not automatically greener on the other side. So to speak. Image file equals image 0009.jpg. The best pal in the world, as I've already said. These are naturally friendly people. When they tell you that they sincerely care about how you are doing, you can trust that they lie awake sleepless for your sake. Just like yellows. Greens are relationship people and their interest in others is genuine and authentic. If you ask a group of people if anyone is prepared to lend a hand and no one steps up to help, a green will jump in and shout, "Choose me." Why? Because he didn't want to leave you in the lurch. He knows that if you don't get any help you'll feel bad. And even though he can be passive, he's always prepared to help a friend. I still remember a young woman I worked with at a consulting firm years ago. Admittedly, Maya was certainly blue as well. But above all, she was green. Her problem was obvious. When someone asked for help, she always said yes. Every time. It was difficult to find her desk due to her workload. But she organized everything in the end. We could always rely on her assistance. Handling all the things the rest of us had simply forgotten about. She had a warm and friendly smile. So we asked her to work in reception and have the first contact with new clients. She never failed to serve coffee, fix the cushions, or keep track of how long clients had been waiting. Maya never forgot anyone's birthday or anniversary, or their wives or children's. For that matter, she frequently sent short emails to all of us stressed out consultants reminding us that we had families who also needed to be looked after. Sure, we could take care of our own lives. But in her kindness and thoughtfulness, Maya went out of her way to help. It was natural for her. And whenever we asked her to take it easy and take care of herself for a change, she almost felt offended. She wanted to take care of us. It simply made her feel good. Of course, there were limits. And Maya constantly ran the risk of someone taking advantage of her huge heart. But when properly balanced, this selflessness is a beautiful quality. Greens do this naturally. When having coffee, it's quite normal for you to ask the people with you if they would like a refill. When other colors would likely take their empty cups to the coffee maker, greens would simply fetch the coffee carafe and refill everyone's cup. A green wants to stay on good terms with everyone. So he'll even help people he doesn't really like that much. Otherwise, there might be some kind of hullabaloo. He thinks well of most people and is confident in others' abilities. Sometimes he does this so intensely that it ends badly. But normally that's the fault of the other person, not the green himself. He is so good-hearted that now and then others can take advantage of him. Lass, a good friend of mine, is a truly genuine friend. It makes no difference how much he has to do. If anyone needs a helping hand, Lass is there, ready to support him. Sometimes, in Lass's eagerness to help with other people's work, he even forgets to do his own. On weekends, he drives his own and others' children everywhere they want to go. He helps people move. He lends out his tools without people even needing to ask. He listens if you call and complain about something. This all takes a huge amount of time. But he enjoys it. Once they've said they'll do something, you can rest assured that it will be done. If a green says that he will do something, you can be confident that he'll do it. If it's in his power to deliver, he will. It won't be done in the shortest amount of time possible. but it will show up in your inbox roughly within the expected time frame. Greens don't want to be caught failing to deliver, as this might cause trouble for others. And because they're good team players, they don't want to do anything that can cause problems for the team. Team comes before self, the team being the company, crew, football team, or family. For the green, it's natural to look after everyone else around them. The reason why everyone works so well with greens is a topic for debate. In some situations, it's simply because they don't like conflict. Mostly, however, it's because they're controlled by their desire to make those around them happy and satisfied. If they can please you with a job well done, they'll do it. The desire to please others verges on being a driving force for greens. It comes naturally and requires no effort. And this selflessness is accompanied by an exalted serenity that lowers the stress level of those around them. We don't want any unpleasant surprises. It's good to know what's going to happen. Every time, you can always count on a green person. In some organizations, it's a requirement to have reliable employees. Creativity and ingenuity are not at the top of the wish list. In short, you simply need people who understand the job and get it done without a lot of fuss or drama. Then you hire greens. They constitute the stable core who will do the job well. They don't have problems taking orders, as long as the orders are formulated in an appealing fashion. Greens enjoy stability and a certain predictability in the workplace, or in the home, or with the family, just about everywhere. Whenever trouble is brewing, maybe due to a recession or when new managers take over, we'll see all kinds of interesting behavior in a group. Reds, who never listen to the whole message, just rush off to do what they believe needs to be done. Unless, of course, they're busy yelling at the management because they don't agree with their decisions. Yellows start wild discussions and inform absolutely everyone about their take on what happened. Instead of working, they'll debate the news until it's time to leave the office. Blues will sit at their desks and begin the bureaucratic paperwork, formulating 500,000 questions that no one knows the answers to yet. Greens? They just murmur. If the management has avoided seriously sabotaging their sense of security, they'll trundle on without complaining. There's no point in making a lot of fuss and bother about it. Might as well keep doing what you were before. This, in fact, makes things much easier. We'll get to how we help greens to change direction. But they're great at keeping calm and carrying on. You'll always know how a green will respond to some questions because he doesn't change his opinion very often. A few years ago, I coached Gregor. He had been a CEO for several years, and his management team consisted solely of green middle managers. He used to enjoy playing a little game when launching new ideas. He wrote little notes with the answers he thought he would get from each person. No, from Anna. Yes, from Stefan. Maybe, from Bertie. Right every time. Gregor knew them very well and knew how they would react to his proposals. This wouldn't have been the case with yellows. They don't even know how they're going to respond when opportunities arise. Exciting, sure, but it's exhausting for those around them. With green associates, however, you don't need to worry. Who? Me? I'm not important. Forget that you even saw me. For every green, the group will always come first, team before self. Remember that. This is a fundamental truth for a green. And it shouldn't be challenged too strongly. The working group, the team, the club, and the family. All these different groups are important for a green. He often disregards his own needs if the group gets what it needs. You may think that groups consist of people, and if each individual is satisfied, the group as a whole will be content. This might happen, but then the focus would be individual rather than collective. The way a green sees it. If the group feels good, every individual also feels good. Here the green's thoughtfulness becomes apparent. He has infinite regard for those around him. This is partly the reason why it's difficult to get a straight answer from a green. He's always trying to satisfy everyone else. Let me tell you a rather striking story. One Sunday a few years ago, a colleague whom I didn't know that well called me. I had only been working with Christopher for a few months, but I hadn't really figured the guy out yet. So when he called me one Sunday morning, I was surprised. I saw who it was, but I had no idea what he wanted from me. He greeted me pleasantly and asked what I was doing. I had just bought a new house at that time and was busy renovating. Christopher asked what was on the agenda this particular Sunday. And I remember that I said I was worried about the boiler. It was early winter. The temperature was just below freezing. And one of the circulation pumps didn't really work as it should. Because colder weather was definitely on the way. I wondered if the pump could cope with a major cold snap. Being a green, Christopher asked a number of questions and gave me lots of good advice. He'd once had a similar boiler. And besides, he knew a plumber whom he might be able to ask to come by and have a look. If I was interested, of course. Christopher and I chatted for a while. And I became increasingly puzzled about why he had actually called me. He asked me where I lived. I gave him the address. And he promised to write it down and give it to his plumber friend. Then, as a kind of, by the way, he asked me if I had any plans to go into town that day. I lived about 25 miles from the office and hadn't intended to go to work that Sunday. I explained this to Christopher. We chatted a little while longer. And in the end I finally asked him straight out what he really wanted. Then he revealed that he was standing outside the office in his t-shirt because he had accidentally locked himself out when he had popped out to fetch some lunch. I looked at the thermometer. 30 degrees with light snow. We'd been talking for about 15 minutes. I got into the car and saved him from freezing to the bone. Everyone else is more important. A green never asks for anything. I know exactly what you mean. They say greens are introverts. That is, that they're active in their inner world. This means that they don't talk just for the sake of talking. When you are quieter than those around you, it's natural that you listen. And greens will listen. They are interested in you and your ideas. Unlike reds, who only listen when there is something to be gained from it. Or yellows, who usually don't listen at all. Although they will normally deny this fact. Greens hear what you're actually saying. They have a genuine ear for human problems. They might not offer any suggestions or solutions. But they understand what you've told them. Don't assume that means that they agree with you. But they are good listeners. So far, you have probably tried to puzzle all the pieces together. Where do the different colors fit in? What kind of job would be best for each of them? These are good questions, even if there are no simple answers. One observation that often arises when I work with these issues in different organizations is that reds, and yellows in particular, must be good at retail and selling. This is true for sure. But greens are often overlooked. We always teach salespeople to talk less and listen more. Something greens already do quite naturally. Helena was a seller I coached a few years ago. She was green and very gentle in her ways. Most people didn't understand how she survived in that daunting industry. But I have a theory. She once told me about a time when she met a tough chief executive everyone had tremendous respect for. No one in the entire company had managed to sell anything to him. But after a little coaching from me, Helena was determined to have a go. So she arranged a meeting. They ran into each other in the parking lot at the restaurant where they were to meet for lunch. The stern executive cruised into the lot in a vintage car from the late 60s. Beautiful, shiny, and obviously very special. Helena said the only thing she could think of. Wow. Do you like cars? Asked the executive. Before they had even greeted each other. Helena nodded. Then he told her about the car. How much he had spent to restore it. The paintwork and alloys. The engine. He showed her what it looked like under the hood. Helena nodded and murmured approval and hoped he wouldn't ask her any questions. Since she couldn't tell the difference between a Ford and a Chevrolet. But she didn't interrupt. She just listened. After that it was easy. They sat down. And he asked to see the sales agreement. How did she do it? By doing nothing at all except for one thing. Listening. He signed before the food was even served. Conclusions on green behavior. Okay. Do you have any greens in your family? Highly likely. Mr. Rogers, Gandhi, Michelle Obama, and Jimmy Carter are some well-known people with elements of green. And, yes, Jesus. There's a guy who knew how to help others. 7. Blue behavior in pursuit of perfection. Why are we doing this? What's the science behind it? The last of the 4 colors is an interesting fellow. You've probably met him. He doesn't make a fuss about himself. But he does keep tabs on what is happening around him. While a green will just go with the flow. A blue has all the right answers. In the background, he analyzes, classifies, evaluates, assesses. You know you've met a blue if you visit someone's home and everything is organized in a particular way. Clear labels and names on each hook so that the children will know exactly where to hang up their jackets. Dinner menus. Divided into 6-week intervals to ensure a balanced diet. Stuck on the refrigerator door. If you look at his tools, you'll find that everything has its own spot and nothing is out of place. Why? A blue DIY guy always puts things back where they belong. He is also a pessimist. Sorry. A realist. He sees errors. And he sees risks. He's the melancholic who closes the circle of behavior. Reserved, analytical, and detail-oriented are some words you might associate with a blue. Excuse me, but that's not quite accurate. We all have a friend like that. Think about it. You are sitting in a restaurant with your friends. You are discussing cats, football, or space rockets. Someone throws out a random comment. It may be your red friend who claims that the Patriots have been to the Super Bowl 11 times. It can be the yellow who cheerfully claims that as a child he lived in the same block as Will Smith. In West Philly, your blue buddy clears his throat and in a gentle voice says that the Patriots have actually only been to the Super Bowl 10 times. With their first appearance after the 1985 season and 8 times since 2001. And that Will Smith actually grew up in Winfield, which is well north of the block in question and a half-hour walk from the lovely Centennial Arboretum. In addition, without blinking an eye, the good friend adds, it's interesting to note that in the Super Bowl pregame coin toss of the past 51 games, the outcome has been tails 27 times and heads 24 times. And based on past statistics, the winner of the coin toss is slightly less likely to win the game overall. You just have to give up. Boys, this guy simply knows everything. He doesn't make a big deal about it. But his way of presenting facts makes it difficult for you to call them into question. He knows where he found the info and can go fetch the book to prove it. That's the way it is with blues. They know how things stand before they open their mouth. They've Googled, read the owner's manual, and checked the dictionary. And afterwards they present a report in full. But an important thing to note. If the question doesn't come up, it's unlikely that your blue buddy will say anything on the subject. He has no need to tell everyone about what he knows. Of course, a blue doesn't know everything. No one can. But you can usually bank on the fact that what he says is correct. Image file equals image 0019.jpg. Did you notice anything about the art above? Of course you did. This time I listed the different characteristics in alphabetical order. Something a blue would certainly appreciate. However, I might get in trouble because I don't discuss each and every one of these characteristics individually on the subsequent pages. To all blue individuals who are reading this, who have probably jotted down a little note in the margin to go to my website to look for possible explanations for this blunder, I just want to say that I didn't mean to cause any strife. It's not a big deal. I was just doing my job. How can a know-it-all be unassuming? It's impressively modest to avoid making a fuss, even if you know everything. It's rare that a wholly blue person would feel the need to stand on the rooftops or to toot his own horn in order to make it clear to the world who the real expert is. It's usually sufficient that you, the blue, are clear about who knows best. There are downsides to this modesty. More than once I've stood in the middle of a crowd of people as we all tried to puzzle through a problem together. On one such occasion, a blue came forward after 2 hours and casually pointed out the answer. For him, it was never really a problem at all. He knew a thing or two. But because blues often miss the big picture, they don't always act immediately. I asked him why he didn't say anything 2 hours earlier. And, like a typical blue, he said, "Well, you never asked." It would be easy to feel aggravated by such a comment. But at the same time, I understood him. It's more my problem than his that he wasn't invited to join the discussion. He knew that he knew the answer. And that was good enough. There's also no need to cheer, applaud, or call a blue up to the podium when he's done something tremendous in an amazing way. Sure, it doesn't really do any harm to cheer. He'll just nod, accept the praise and the prize check, and then return to his desk, where he'll continue working on the next project. But he may well wonder what the fuss was really all about. He was only doing his job. Excuse me, but where did you read that? And what edition was it? A blue can really get too many facts or have too many pages of fine print. People say that God is in the details. And I can imagine that it was a blue who first said that. No detail is too small to be noticed. Cutting corners is simply not an option for a blue. Hold up, you might say. Not keeping track of every single tiny detail isn't really the same thing as cutting corners. But, if you ask a blue, it is. Not having full control is the same thing as not having any control at all. What do we get by cutting corners? How can you possibly justify it? Quote, "It doesn't work like that." Tell a blue that he can ignore the details of the new contract and skip the last 30 paragraphs. There's nothing important in that bit. And he'll stare at you very attentively and wonder about your mental capabilities. As usual, he won't necessarily say anything. He'll just completely ignore what you said. He would rather burn the midnight oil checking all the facts of the case than miss the slightest detail. A few years ago, I tried to sell a leadership program to the CEO of a company in the packaging industry. He was blue. There was no doubting that. His emails were long-winded and a little dry. And for our first meeting he had set aside 50 minutes. Not an hour. Not 3/4 of an hour. But 50 minutes. There was a reason for this. After the meeting he would have lunch. And the dining room was 8 minutes away. Plus a visit to the gents for about 2 minutes. A 50-minute meeting would get him there right in time. The first time we met, he deposited me in a specific chair by a specific corner at the visitor's desk. He didn't ask if I had any difficulty getting there, which I did. The address was totally impossible. He offered neither coffee nor tea. He didn't smile when he greeted me. He examined my business card very carefully. After going through the company's needs, I explained that I would go back to my office to put a quote together. Once back at my desk, I brooded about how I should go about it. Normally, my proposals were 10 to 12 pages long. But I knew that wouldn't be sufficient in this case. Instead, I put my nose to the grindstone and wrote over 35 pages. I mailed a hard copy of the quote to him. Since for a blue the written and printed word means much more than the spoken or digital. After a week or so, I followed the whole thing up with a phone call. They were interesting ideas, the CEO said. But he was ready to go further. Could he now get the full quote? What he actually said was, "Is there any more material?" I remember scratching my head. In my opinion, I had described the program rather well in the proposal. Each stage had an agenda, a clear goal, and a defined purpose. I'd given some background information, references, and citations. As a seller, you can't give up. So I was back at it, adding every detail I could think of. The second time, I put together at least 85 pages. Each item broken down into 2-hour intervals. Even more background, sample exercises, analysis tools, templates, the works, details on a level that would have made a yellow throw up. Pleased with myself, I sent over the whole caboodle. It took several weeks before I heard from the CEO. I asked if he was ready to make a decision and he asked, "Is there more material?" Well, this time he wanted to come to my office. For 90 minutes, we sat on the same side of the table in the conference room at my office and went through the table of contents in the proposal. He had drawn up the general terms and conditions. Read the fine print on legal paper, and each section was full of questions and notes. Afterwards, he said with a totally expressionless face that it was the best meeting he had been at for a long time. But what he really wondered was, "Is there any more material?" I sent him off and sat down for a while and pondered. More material? No problem. I shared the whole training folder. This was before e-learning in virtual classrooms. At least 300 pages covering every 15-minute session during the 15 days of training in 5 different stages of leadership. This was all the material there was. Even with information about when coffee breaks should be slotted in. Exactly what questions should be asked of the individuals during training. How the room should be furnished. The works. I can certify. There were no gaps. I thought that if I took all this and rammed it down his throat, he would be satisfied at last. After a month, he asked if there was any more material. There was not. A common misconception is that blues are unable to make decisions. But that's not the case. It wasn't that this CEO was pushing the decision into some time in the future or that he couldn't decide. He simply had no need to decide. For him, the process leading up to the decision was significantly more interesting. And he just wondered if there was any more material. Why some people have to sleep on things for so long, you wonder if they've gone into hibernation. The preceding example also illustrates another important characteristic blue behavior. They're generally very cautious. They often think safety first, where a red or yellow would take a wild chance. A blue will hold off and consider everything one more time. There may be more factors to take into account. Right? You need to get to the bottom of things before you act. This can manifest itself in various ways. It's a fact that for the blue, the trip is more important than the destination. Exactly the opposite of a red. Obviously, this amount of caution can result in no decisions being made at all. And it also means that blues rarely take any major risks. Never taking any risks ensures a predictable life. We can probably agree on that. I'm not saying anything about how exciting and inspiring it would be. I'm just stating the facts. Sometimes a blue can even completely refrain from starting something because he can't assess the risks. I once met a blue seller who had trained as an engineer. His motto was that the best deal is often the one you didn't make. Risk assessment is a complex thing. And who knows what dangers are lurking out there? A blue generally solves everything by creating advanced systems that manage the possible risks that may arise. They set 3 alarm clocks. They leave 2 hours early when one would be enough. They check and recheck the children's backpacks before school in the morning. Even though they packed them the night before and no one has touched the backpacks during the night. They triple check that the keys are in their pocket and, of course, they are. Where else would they be? The benefits of this are evident. Blues won't be taken aback by unexpected events in the same way others would be. And in the long run, they save a lot of time. It doesn't matter if it's easier. It's still not right. Things can't be allowed to go wrong. That's all there is to it. Quality is all that matters. When a blue individual thinks his work runs the risk of being shoddy or low quality, things come to a standstill. Everything must be checked out. Why has the quality declined? Running the risk of generalizing. I would say that a fair number of engineers have distinct blue traits. Accurate, systematic, fact-oriented, and quality-conscious. I can't know for certain. But I would imagine that Toyota, the Japanese car manufacturer, probably has a good proportion of blue engineers among its employees. They have a policy that you must always ask, why, 5 times to ensure quality and get to the heart of the issue. I would say that this is a typical blue approach. In addition to the Japanese mentality, which is very long-term and rather blue in expression. So let's say someone discovers an oil stain on the floor. A red approach might be to lambaste the person closest to him and then order him to mop up the stain. A yellow sees the stain and then forgets it, but 2 days later is surprised when he slips on it. The green also sees the stain and feels a little bit of guilt because it poses a problem and everyone is ignoring it. A blue would ask, why is there an oil spill? The answer may be that a gasket is leaking. This answer, of course, is unsatisfactory for a blue. Why is the gasket leaking? Because it's poor quality. Why do we have poor quality gaskets in our factory? Because the purchasing department was told to save money. We bought cheap gaskets instead of tight-sealed gaskets. But who asked us to save money and compromise on quality? This is the way he goes on. Maybe the problem will resolve itself. Maybe we'll get a report of what went wrong. But nothing is done to fix the problem. In the end, the blue solution might be to review our purchasing strategies instead of just mopping up the oil on the floor. My point is this. A blue is prepared to dive deep to get everything exactly 100% correct. Blues argue that if they're going to do something, they must do it correctly. And vice versa. If a task isn't worth being done properly, then it's not worth doing at all. Furthermore, because blues usually find it difficult to lie, they will always point out the defects they uncover, even defects that may reflect poorly on them. I clearly remember discussions my parents had when I was a child. We moved from time to time, and usually our house had to be sold, with everything that entailed. Dad, the engineer, would, of course, do all the work himself. And he managed the viewings personally. My mum was always upset that he began each viewing by pointing out all the flaws and shortcomings of the house. It leaked here and there, and some paint had flaked off behind the sofa. Why are you telling them that? My mother wondered. Because this and that is wrong, Dad replied. Sure, but do you have to tell that to the prospective buyers? Now they may never want to buy the house. Quote, he didn't understand the problem. As a very honorable and honest person, he couldn't hide the faults he knew were there. He could live with the fact that we really made a huge profit on those deals. He'd been honest about the house. Because that's how it should be done. If the trail doesn't match the map, there's something wrong with the trail. Logical and rational thinking is critical to a blue. Out with all the feelings. As much as possible. And in with logic. Of course, blues can't turn off their feelings completely. No one can. But they like to say they use rational arguments when making decisions. They value logical thinking highly. But they can very easily become depressed when things don't go their way. And depression has nothing to do with logic and everything to do with feelings. Few people can repeat the same task an infinite number of times in exactly the same way like blues can. They have a unique ability to precisely follow instructions to the letter without questioning. Provided they understood and approved of it in the beginning. How do they do this without getting bored or careless? Well, it's logical. If a particular method works, why change it? While a yellow or red would find new ways of doing something simply because they were bored. A blue repeats the same thing time and time again. Consider how a blue would put together a piece of furniture from IKEA. If there's a manual, then of course you have to read it thoroughly before you start. Reds, confident that they can easily do this, start screwing and putting together the various parts without even looking to see what's in play. Rest of the box, yellows tear up everything, exclaiming that it's going to be great fun to get the furniture in place. They live in the future and can already see a clear picture of the new cabinet on the right wall. Of the bedroom with grandma's tablecloth and a lovely vase of tulips on it. They put each part together a little bit haphazardly. Without much effort. They'll screw in a few screws where it looks logical only to skip to another part of the cabinet. A green DIY guy leans the enormous box against the wall and has a coffee break. There really isn't a hurry. What does a blue do? He reads the instructions twice, examines what everything looks like, and confirms that the different pieces of the new cabinet match the pictures in the instructions. With a slightly damp, not too wet, cloth, he carefully wipes down all the different parts because they are likely to be dusty. He tallies the number of screws in the box so that he will not be surprised at the end if anything is missing. And if there are any parts left over, he may very well take the whole thing apart again. It may take a little extra time for a blue to put together his cabinet. But once it's done, you can be sure that it will stand forever. The devil is in the details. A few years ago, I wanted to renovate the patio in my yard. Because I like working with my hands. In contrast to just talking each day. I thought I would do the job myself. Or at least part of it. My dad, well over 70 at the time, was going to help out because he knew that I was pressed for time. Easier said than done. To provide a sturdy foundation, we were going to lay down gravel. Dad arrived a few moments before the dump truck with all the gravel. He had his own wheelbarrow with him, specially designed to maneuver gravel, and a special shovel that he always used for similar purposes. He didn't understand why I was standing there with my regular shovel. Everyone knew that you had to use special shovels for things like this. The truck came and dropped a hefty pile of gravel in the driveway. I imagined a few days of shoveling before me. And to be honest, it made me feel a little tired. But I was still ready to take on the challenge. My old dad? He picked up a bit of gravel between his fingers. Smelled it. Felt it. and assessed its quality. After grunting somewhat, which I interpreted as approval, he began to assess the pile itself. He measured the height of the mound with his hand. He paced how large the circumference was. I asked him what he was doing. He didn't answer but mumbled numbers under his breath. 180 high. 5 meters in circumference. Gradient. After 30 seconds, he said that there were between 8.75 and 9.25 cubic meters of gravel in the driveway. I confided to him that it was actually 9 cubic meters. Exactly. Dad asked rather skeptically how I knew that. I pointed. It's written on the truck, I said. Dad was mildly impressed. I asked if he wanted to count each piece of gravel individually. He didn't deem that to be necessary. For hours, he walked around the site and packed and pressed, raked the gravel, smoothing everything until he thought that everything was in order. He used a level, plumb line, water, all the means at his disposal, so that nothing would go wrong. The gravel needed to be laid at an incline of exactly 1 centimeter per meter. Why, you ask? It says so in the book. Because he was a construction engineer. He knew the book by heart. 1 centimeter per meter. Exactly. Who knows what terrible consequences could result if you were careless about that? Consider the difference between 1 centimeter and roughly 1 centimeter. The former is precise. The latter is imprecise. Roughly 1 centimeter. It could be up 2 centimeters if things went bad. From a 1 centimeter to a 2 centimeter gradient. That's a difference of no less than 100%. A huge deviation. The funny thing about this story is not really the event itself, but what happened when Dad read about it in the first edition of this book. He argued that that's not how it really happened. He corrected the story on several points and claimed that the truck had held 12 cubic meters, not 9. He also insists that he's not purely blue, and there might just be something in that. He's like that with everything. At home, if there are any technical questions about a television, a car, a microwave oven, or a cell phone, out comes the manual. He always replies, "It says here that. Why do you think they wrote this stuff if it's not meant to be done that way?" Quote, how do you reply to that? How do you argue with the instruction manual? It's impossible to find arguments that a true blue will accept. My dad will also stop at a red light in the middle of the night, even if he is the only one within a 10-mile radius. Because that's the way you do it. The great value of this approach is obvious. He will never be fooled. He will always get what he paid for. It gives him an inner peace because he knows he has checked everything out very accurately. If you know any blues, I am sure you will agree with me. Under normal circumstances, they're very calm and balanced. Probably because they keep tabs on everything. Silence is golden. Introvert. Enough said. I could stop there. Many blues I've met don't say a single word unnecessarily. That's just the way it is. Does that mean they have nothing to say? Don't they have opinions about things? Not at all. They are just very, very introverted. Blues are the calm, stable individuals the Aztecs equated with the sea. The element of water. Quiet on the outside, but under the surface anything could be happening. Introverted doesn't mean silent. It means active in the inner world. But the effect of this is often quiet. In general, my advice is to listen attentively when blues do actually talk. Because they've usually thought through what they say. So why are they so silent? Among other things, it's because they, unlike yellows, don't feel the need to be heard. Sitting in a corner and not being seen or heard makes no difference to them. They are observers, spectators, more than central characters. They can find themselves at the edge of a group where they observe and record everything that is. said. And don't forget this. According to a blue's values, being silent is something positive. If you have nothing to say, keep quiet. Conclusions on blue behavior. Do you know everything about blues? Have you identified some blues in your life? Bill Gates and Albert Einstein both used their attention to detail and meticulous nature to build their success. We also have Sandra Day O'Connor and Condoleezza Rice. And of course, from the fictional world, Mr. Spock from Star Trek is the perfect blue. All logic, rationality, and intellect, even if a few of the jokes slip past him. 8. No one is completely perfect. Strengths and weaknesses. As the title of this book suggests, there are individuals around us who, under less favorable circumstances, we may find challenging to understand. There are others we don't understand at all, no matter what the situation is. And the most difficult to interact with are those who aren't like us, because they obviously behave incorrectly. The differences begin to become clear. You can see the general differences among the different colors. The illustration on page 63 shows an example of how they differ. Some people are issue-oriented, and others are relation-oriented. While two of them, red and yellow, are quick to act, the greens and blues are reflective. This is often the source of everyday misunderstandings, both large and small. I will come back to this on page 193. But I would like to take this opportunity to provide some nuances to the illustration of the different core behavior patterns that each color represents. I'm not saying that you would call people idiots, like Stir, who opened my eyes at the beginning of this book. However, in all honesty, all of us, on occasion, have just stood there, unable to comprehend a comment we've heard or watched someone behave in a way that is diametrically opposed to how we would have behaved. And so we believe that they're idiots. Image file equals image 0017.jpg. This reasoning assumes that I am always right, which of course means that the other person and their form of behavior is automatically wrong. It's a tricky question. A wise person once said that, just because you're right, I don't have to be wrong. We also tend to pay special attention to the faults and shortcomings of others. Child psychologists have argued that the things we find most shocking in the behavior of our children are the things we recognize in ourselves, but wish we didn't do. So who decides what kind of behavior is right and wrong? Time for a real cliché. On the one hand, no one is perfect. There you go. A real platitude. But really, there are no perfect human beings. No one is without faults or shortcomings. In my youth, I was constantly looking for a role model who could become my mentor in life. That person, a man or woman, completely free from shortcomings. But I never found one. I still haven't seen any trace of this elusive perfect human. And, of course, that's the way it is. We live with our shortcomings and make the best of things. On the other hand, when we think someone is an idiot, is it really because of their faults and shortcomings, or have we failed to understand them? An attribute that may be useful in some situations is unsuitable in others. It's important to remember that communication usually takes place on the recipient's terms, whatever people's judgment of me may be. That is the way they perceive me, regardless of what I really meant or intended. As always, it's all about self-awareness. Good qualities can become drawbacks in the wrong circumstances, no matter what the quality is. Quick review of core behavior patterns. Reds are quick and more than happy to take command if needed. They make things happen. However, when they get going, they become control freaks and can be hopeless to deal with. And they repeatedly trample on people's toes. Yellows can be amusing, creative, and elevate the mood regardless of who they're with. However, When they are given unlimited space, they will consume all the oxygen in the room. They won't allow anyone into a conversation. And their stories will reflect reality less and less. The friendly greens are easy to hang out with because they are so pleasant and genuinely care for others. Unfortunately, they can be too wishy-washy and unclear. Anyone who never takes a stand eventually becomes difficult to handle. You don't know where they really stand. And indecision kills the energy in other people. The analytical blues are calm, level-headed, and think before they speak. Their ability to keep a cool head is undoubtedly an enviable quality for all who aren't capable of doing that. However, blues' critical thinking can easily turn to suspicion and questioning those around them. Everything can become suspect and sinister. In the following sections, I deal with how people might perceive the weaknesses of certain behavior patterns. Naturally, this is a sensitive area and can be easily misunderstood. When I coach individuals, this is usually where things can get messy. So as you read on, be aware that much is in the eye of the beholder. Who is right and who is wrong? The behavior patterns I am talking about are described as other people may perceive them. Even if the intention of the person who just made a fool of himself might have been completely different. One thing I know for sure regarding the different colors is that each color evaluates themselves in different ways. Reds and yellows tend to inflate their strengths and believe that they have no weaknesses. They have powerful egos, and a great part of their success can probably be attributed to the fact that they don't get bogged down in faults and shortcomings but instead look for opportunities and good news. Clearly, this can't be maintained over time. Conversely, greens and blues usually exaggerate their weaknesses and in certain cases even ignore their strengths. The consequences are clear. When you give positive feedback to a green or a blue, they sometimes appear to be immune to it and change the subject to something that went seriously wrong. Obviously, this is highly unpredictable. Well, are we ready to go? How red people are perceived. If you ask other people about reds, you might get a different picture from the one the red gives of himself. What a surprise! My own private research shows that reds are surrounded by more idiots than the rest of us. Many people will agree with what you have read up to now about reds. But I have also heard other comments. Usually, they express this when the red is not in the room because they are afraid of his fiery temper. You've heard him say that he wants to hear the truth. Over the years, he's bellowed into our ears, "Say what you think." But as soon as you do, you find yourself in the middle of a heated discussion with an angry red. This means that what you are going to read now will often be completely new for many reds. Not many of us have ever been able to make these points to a red before. It takes way too much energy. Some people say that reds are just belligerent, arrogant, and egotistical. They are perceived as unyielding, impatient, aggressive, and controlling. I don't think this is necessarily correct. But I've even heard people speak about people with red behavior as dictatorial and tyrannical. Suddenly the picture isn't as flattering. The born leader reveals his blemished side. First of all, let me say this. Nothing said previously would necessarily bother a red. Because he is more task-oriented than relationship-oriented. Besides, everyone else is wrong. But let's see what everyone else has to say. Why does everything take so long? Can't you speed things up a bit? Well, what can you say? A person willing to step outside any regulatory framework to get ahead is nothing if not impatient. When the usual official channels take too long, a red will scale over a few levels of decision makers and expeditiously look for the person who really calls the shots. The first example that comes to mind was the traffic in my beautiful capital city. Sure, Many locals are in more of a hurry than the national average when they sit behind the wheel. There are statistics about this. But since we're talking about red behavior, I'd like to tell you about a colleague I had a few years ago. BJORN and I used a car as our principal means of transport in and around the city. It simply took too long to use public transport. BJORN lost his license every so often because of his somewhat liberal approach to speed limits. He lived far outside the city, and the journey into the office, about 20 miles away, could take about 40 minutes. That was on a good day. It could just as easily take an hour and a half. BJORN really felt the need to adjust his driving according to the flow of traffic. His opinion was that there was no reason for him to follow every single traffic rule. The posted speed limits here and there, 50, 60, and so on, they were mostly recommendations. They didn't apply to him. They were there for people who didn't really know how to drive a car. On one occasion I was sitting in the office with a few colleagues having a cup of coffee, discussing the rather serious traffic situation. It felt as if the city was on the verge of a traffic infarction. BJORN didn't know what we were talking about. He wasn't aware of the problem at all. On the contrary, he felt that the traffic hadn't been bad lately. When we questioned him a bit more, it turned out that he usually drove in the bus lane all the way, for over 20 miles. It was so much quicker that way. BJORN even maintained that this was okay. You could even get a permit for the bus lane. That's what he did. And it cost him about $140 a month. About every 4 weeks the police stopped him. But it was worth it. Just imagine how much time he saved. And all it cost him was the fines. He felt it was a good deal. This story illustrates quite clearly how red behavior works. They know just as well as everyone else that it's wrong to break the rules. However, since it's quicker that way, they do it anyway. Reds are notorious rule breakers. Once again, I would like to remind you of their intentions. To get the job done. Reds have no problem taking 1 or 2 shortcuts. As long as it's about getting things done. With such a generous approach to regulations and rules, you'll definitely arrive faster. I would even say that a red is often so fast that if something were to go wrong he would still manage to redo the project. At the same time, no one else ever really knows what's going to happen. I'm not screaming. I'm not angry. Arg. Because the way Reds communicate is so blunt and so direct. Many perceive them as aggressive. This is logical. But at the same time this perception varies, depending on who becomes the victim of the Reds' forceful points of view. For instance, in Sweden it's not acceptable to behave in the kind of confrontational manner that would be fine in Germany or France. I'm not saying that people quarrel more in these countries, but that they have a slightly different approach to conflicts. Just imagine. In many workplaces people are encouraged to be candid and have open communication. What does this really mean? It's easy to interpret it as meaning we should all be honest with one another and just say whatever we think, right? We want to have open and forthright dialogue. That's excellent. For any organization to be efficient, it's necessary to have straightforward communication about things that are important. So who excels at frank communication? And can receive the same without getting cranky? Answer: no one. Besides Reds. Of course. For them, this is a non-issue. Why are we even talking about communication? It's obvious that you say what you think. Many people find this stressful. To constantly have the truth pushed into your face can be onerous if you have difficulty taking it. My goal here isn't to define what's right or wrong. I only want to establish that all of us are different. So why do we sometimes perceive red behavior as threatening and belligerent? Could it be that they don't give up right away? That they like to argue and debate even small matters if they find them important? That they'll raise their voices, glare daggers at people, and pound their fists on the table if it suits them? That sometimes they express themselves rather rudely? Imagine the following scenario. You have a project, something that you've spent a few days on, or maybe even weeks. You begin to doubt yourself. Have you succeeded at your work? Is it as good as you wanted it to be? Would you dare show it to the client as it is now? Or should you ask for some feedback from someone who you know will give you an honest answer? Just then a red comes sauntering by. And you take a chance. You are fully aware that this colleague, spouse, friend, cousin, neighbor, will be honest. You ask for a frank opinion. With a degree of pride in your voice, you show him what you've accomplished. And you go through your process step by step. Without you noticing, the red becomes impatient because he's already decided what his opinion is and he's getting tired of you doing all the talking for so long. With a wave of his hand that effectively silences you, the red says, "It doesn't look that good. I don't really like what you've done here. In fact, it looks pretty rough. I'm amazed that you didn't do better than this. I think you have to redo the whole thing from start to finish." Then he leaves without thinking any more about it. You're left there feeling forlorn and crushed, regardless of what color you are. Exaggerated? Can this happen in real life? At this stage, if you believe that such nasty people don't really exist, then you've never met a genuine red. Or the reds you have met have essentially learned how to be dishonest. Think about it. What's the purpose of cutting a person down to size so completely? What were the red's intentions? It was to do exactly what you asked. You wanted an honest opinion. Say exactly what you think, you said. It's possible you even added, "I won't be angry, sad, disappointed, suicidal." Be prepared, says the red. Because here it comes. By asking for an honest opinion, you released a flood of brutal candor. But you'll survive. Perhaps with your self-confidence a little waterlogged and your ego utterly drowned. As a consultant, I have explained countless times that when a red goes all out on an issue that's important to him, an issue on which he does not intend to give up, well, the storm will be brutal. If you're afraid of conflict, then you shouldn't put yourself in that situation. A red has no problem with conflict. Reds don't consciously create conflict. But a refreshing quarrel every now and then can be a good thing. Don't you think? It's just another way to communicate. A little tip. The worst thing you can do once you get into a conflict with a red is back off. That tactic can cause you serious problems. More on that later. What are you doing over there? I can see what you're not doing. What's behind the need to control? Simply put, the desire for control is a phenomenon where an individual needs to have power over a situation in which either groups or individuals are present. Those who have control needs often feel extremely uneasy about having to adapt themselves to a group or a situation and will eagerly come up with various strategies to avoid this. A common form of behavior is to talk constantly, interrupting and ignoring others, in order to maintain control over the conversation. Reds can probably be perceived as extremely overbearing, but it's important to note they are interested in controlling those around them, but not in controlling every specific detail of a situation. Attention to our control over detail isn't something we can accuse reds of. But it is important for a red to feel that he can influence what people do and how they intend to act on certain specific issues. At the heart of this need for control is a belief that they know more than anyone else. And because a red feels he knows best, he will keep tabs on everyone around him to ensure that they all do the right thing. The advantage for a red is that he gets everything done his way. The disadvantage is obvious. Everyone else feels controlled. Some people think it's a good thing when someone else makes the decisions and holds the baton. But others feel limited and just want to escape. Many years ago, I worked for a company in which one of the middle managers was quite red. She was also a bit blue. See the section on blue behavior. When she delegated tasks to the employees, the effect was quite amusing. She usually had no problem relinquishing certain things. She was even good at delegating enjoyable tasks, something many executives can find difficult. However, since she was red, she was very quick in thought and action. In practice, this meant that she hung around after she had delegated a specific task. And if the task wasn't done immediately, she would simply go and do it herself. When the employee in question got to that item on his to-do list, he often discovered that it had already been done. Note: the deadline hadn't been reached yet. Because this middle manager was red-blue, she did a much better job than what the employee would have had he been given the chance. Red means fast. Blue means high quality in implementation. Unfortunately, criticism of the employee's sluggishness was not slow in coming, as the blue part of this manager was precise with the details and the red part gave criticism very readily. She was perceived as quite rigid. Which brings us on to the next section. I try to care about you, but it would help if you were a little more interesting. Have you ever met a person completely without feelings? No, I thought so. Once again, reds are not typical relational people. Nothing wrong with that, as long as the person you are communicating with has the same focus as you. But if a red speaks to a pronounced relational person, like a yellow or a green, he can be perceived as very cold-hearted or inhuman. Let me illustrate this with an example from my own personal experience. I had a colleague, whom I always appreciated very much. Notice that I start with the positives. To avoid ruffling feathers. Very Swedish of me. And still have great respect for as a professional but also as a good friend. Okay. It's the infamous BORN again. A few years ago, we were having a tough period in the company. Fall had been a difficult and strenuous time. Long days, late nights, and frequent weekend work. We had worn ourselves out. We had worn one another out. And we had worn out our respective families. We were on our knees. We really deserved a quiet and restful holiday season. For the company holiday party, we went to a Japanese restaurant. We had taken our shoes off and were sitting on cushions, each holding a glass of sake in his hands. In typical Swedish fashion, we looked at the menus while, at the same time, keeping an eye on what the others were thinking of ordering. Of course, most of us didn't want to order something that no one else chose. Except for BORN. He glanced quickly through the menu and declared what he had in mind. He was ready now and quickly grew weary of those of us who hadn't decided yet. Needing something to do, he started a conversation. At the time, my daughter had just changed schools. And BORN was inquisitive. How did everything go with the new school? How's the little lassie doing? Pleasantly surprised by his concern for my daughter, I started to tell him. After about 20 seconds I noted that BORN's eyes began to wander. He looked around the restaurant with a facial expression that said, "Why is he telling me this?" He looked at me with a smile I interpreted as, "You know me. You know how I function. I don't actually want to talk any more about that." And he quickly began talking about something completely different. Ordinarily, I should have been a little bit offended. Maybe even insulted. How can anyone be so insensitive? Especially when the other person is talking about something that he himself inquired about. Does this mean that Bjorn is cold-hearted or that he cares nothing for other people? Not at all. He cares just as much as anyone else. But when he realized that everything was fine with my daughter, he simply lost interest in usual fashion. He announced that the channel of communication was closed. Instead of sitting there hemming and hawing, pretending to be interested in more or less meaningless details, he said exactly what he felt. Remember that we're talking about interpretations and perceptions here. The intention behind a particular behavior is one thing. How we as recipients perceive it is another. Personally, I just wanted to laugh the whole thing off. Because I knew Bjorn very well. I knew that he would never dream of hurting anyone deliberately. When he tramples on people's toes from time to time, it's never intentional. It just happens. In reality, he is one of the warmest and most generous people I have ever met. It's just that you have to know him to understand this. What would have been the correct answer to Bjorn's question about my daughter? Great. It would have been enough. It takes strength to be alone. And I'm the strongest of you all. The word, egotistic, comes from the Latin word, ego, meaning I. My I is, therefore, my ego. Linguistically, we have consequently chosen to put some kind of equal sign between people with strong egos and being selfish. Naturally, there are many people in our world who are selfish and egotistical. The world is teeming with them. Again, I want you to remember that we are speaking here about perceived behavior. If we look at how a red communicates, we can understand why many perceive him as egotistic. I think we should accept this proposal. I want that assignment. This is what I think about it. I have a good idea. Will we do this my way or the wrong way? Quote. Add a sharp eye and distinctive body language and you will see someone who will take what he wants. He will fight for his interests. He will tell everyone who will listen that he is capable of doing whatever he undertakes. Some people, especially Greens, find that this I form of speaking is unsettling. A red's I message occupies their minds. They share this trait with yellows, who also have strong egos. But we've learned to take care of one another. We know that being solitary is not the same thing as being strong. That we need one another to survive. Cooperation is the model. And I've preached this for over 2 decades. So we think it's egotistic when Reds speak only about themselves. They make sure to help themselves before helping others. They are often willing to trample on someone else if they see an opportunity to advance themselves. They may not do this consciously, but the effect is the same. Reds often come out the winners in discussions. They see this as a natural part of a conversation. They always know best and will assert that everyone else is wrong. It suits their ego to behave this way. The aftermath of this method is that they lose friends. People can dislike them, and they are cut off from information because no one wants them in the group. Once they've noticed this, they may well just decide that all the other people are idiots. A few years ago, I was one of 6 people who was seated at the table having an evening meal. In some anguish, a man, green-blue, told me he was not feeling well. He couldn't live up to the responsibilities his employer laid on his shoulders. He was hard-pressed by his burdensome workload, and he found it difficult to sleep at night. This caused even more stress for him because he knew that if he didn't get a good night's rest, it would be even harder for him to perform at work. His wife, sitting beside him, tried to hide her discomfort. The situation was certainly not comfortable for anyone in the room. Everyone at the table offered encouraging remarks along with cautious questions about how he thought he might be able to reverse the difficult situation. We all expressed our support as far as we could. Except for the red. After 10 minutes, The only red at the table finally had enough and tore into the distraught, stressed out little devil. The red's analysis was as clear as day. I think you complain too much. You are just earning your salary. I've never been sick. And I think people worry too much. I would never end up in your situation. And I really think you should pull yourself together. What a dinner that was. Let's be honest. Reds are the ones who always believe they are surrounded by idiots. How yellow people are perceived funny, entertaining, and almost divinely positive. Absolutely. Again, this is their own interpretation. If you ask other people about yellows, you may well get a somewhat different picture. Many people will agree with what you have read up to now. But you will also hear other comments. It's especially fun to ask the blues. They will say that yellows are selfish, superficial, and overly self-confident. Someone else will say that they talk too much and are bad listeners. Combine that with the observation that they can be distracted and careless. Suddenly the picture is not as flattering. When a yellow hears these comments, one of two things can happen. Either he gets deeply distressed and genuinely hurt, or he sets off a ferocious argument. It depends. What's striking is that, over time, none of this criticism will really torment a yellow very much. On the one hand, he's a bad listener, and on the other hand, he has what some psychologists might call a selective memory. He simply forgets the difficult bits. And with his positive ethos, he finds it easy to say to himself that he doesn't have any faults or shortcomings. Let's have a look at what yellows struggle with, even if they don't always know it. Hello, anyone there? Listen to what happened to me. You want to know, right? At the beginning of this chapter, I pointed out that yellows are very good communicators. I would like to repeat that now. Yellows are very good communicators. With an emphasis on very. None of the other colors come close to the yellow's ease in finding words, expressing themselves, and telling a story. It comes so easily, so simply, so effortlessly, that you can't help being impressed. It's common knowledge that most people don't like speaking in front of others. They get heart palpitations and sweaty palms, terrified of making fools of themselves. This is totally alien to yellows. Making fools of themselves isn't part of the deal. And if the improbable were to happen, you could always laugh it off with another amusing anecdote. However, it may be too much of a good thing. Regardless of what you are good at, there is a limit, a time to break off. Yellows, especially those without self-awareness, don't have such a limit. It would never even occur to them to wrap up. If they have something to say, out it comes. The fact that no one else thinks it's important is neither here nor there. A yellow behaves exactly like most people. He does what he's good at. And he is good at talking. There are countless examples of yellows who completely dominate a conversation. Then add a hefty dose of poor listening and an interesting read. One-sided communication takes place. Many people become hugely frustrated by this limitless verbosity. It's often perceived as egocentrism. The terms windbag, verbal diarrhea, and motormouth were more than likely coined with yellows in mind. Countless times I've experienced the following. A group of people are sitting around a boardroom table. The top dog in the room expresses an idea. It can be about anything at all. When the time comes for comments, all the yellows will reinforce the idea by repeating the exact same thing, possibly with their own words. I would like to say to the women reading this that I am aware of the fact that this is more male behavior than female. Why do they do that? Well, first, it's important to signal when you are in agreement. And second, they can say it so much better. A few years ago, I was with a management team studying group dynamics. I had just purchased a cell phone with a stopwatch. Using this, I could time who had spoken in the group and for how long. In the room were the CEO and his 7 closest associates. Peter, the sales manager, was really yellow and he had only had 1 point of the 19 on the agenda. Take a good look at the ratio 1:19. This represents around 5.3% of the agenda. The CEO opened the meeting. But pretty soon a clear pattern emerged. Peter had opinions about every single item on the agenda. I used my stopwatch and was fascinated by what I saw. He spoke 69% of the time. Yes, it's true. 31% went to the other 7, including the CEO himself. If you're yellow, you may have already charged on ahead in this book, because you possibly recognized yourself and thought that this was a very unfair example. Everyone else is wondering how that's even possible. How can one person dominate the conversation so fully? It's possible because yellows have no problems delivering opinions, views, and advice regardless of whether they know anything about the subject or not. A yellow has a generous approach to his own ability. When an idea pops up in his head, he simply opens his mouth. People say that for reds thought and action are the same thing. For yellows, I would suggest the idea that thought and speech are interrelated. What yellows share is often completely unprocessed material that just tumbles out of the big opening on their faces. Sure, it might be well thought out, but it's usually not. What's most deceptive is that, almost without exception, it sounds very good. Yellows know a thing or two about presenting an idea so that it always sounds fantastic. If you're unfamiliar with this particular person, you may very well take everything he says as true. A serious mistake. Very often a yellow is both entertaining and inspiring. And as I said, they can inspire people to new ideas. But should you get into a conversation with a yellow, you need to be observant so that when he catches his breath you can quickly insert a comment. Or simply close the meeting. I know it looks messy, but there's a method to the madness. A yellow would hardly admit that he's careless. But he has no natural way to keep track of things. He finds working in a structured way boring. Then you have to fit the mold and follow the template. If there is anything that yellows avoid, it's feeling controlled by fixed systems. The solution is to keep everything in your head, which doesn't work. It's not possible to remember everything. So inevitably the yellow forgets and those around him think he's careless. Missed appointments, forgotten deadlines, and half-finished projects, all because once his mind has finished the task he doesn't go backwards. He goes forward, leaps to the next project, deals with other things, details. To complete a project, you usually need to be precise about details. Yellows don't like keeping track of details. I would even venture to say that they're not interested in details. They paint with broad strokes. Generally, yellows are very good at launching things. They're resourceful, and with boundless creativity at their disposal, they can kick off various kinds of projects. But they're not as good at finishing things. Finishing anything 100% requires an ability to concentrate that a yellow rarely possesses. He gets tired and moves on. And so we think that he's careless. He thinks that his work is good enough. My goodness, why worry about trifles? This turned out quite well. After all, the fact that threads are hanging from the shirt or that the document is full of spelling errors is not as important as thinking up new things. This is repeated in many different spheres. I have a few acquaintances who are hopeless at keeping time. They are always pleased and excited to think things up. But they are optimists when it comes to time. It makes absolutely no difference what time you suggest. They will not be on time. 7 o'clock, 7:30, or 8. It's unimportant. They're late regardless. And when they talk about it, they haggle down their late arrival from 45 minutes to a little over 15 minutes. After a while, they actually believe it themselves. But it doesn't matter. The rest of us wait patiently because their presence will be the highlight of the evening. Look, I can juggle all the balls at the same time. We need to talk a little about Yellow's inability to concentrate. He's always prepared for new experiences. This is the downside to the incredible openness Yellows have for new things, ideas, and impressions. There are so many new things. And because new is synonymous with good for a Yellow, it's best that something new happens all the time. Otherwise, our Yellow friend will lose focus. He can't be bothered listening to the whole story, the background, and all the details and facts that may actually be relevant. It's not interesting to him. And he will lose his concentration. What does he do then? Simple. Something else. He throws up another ball to juggle. The problem with all these balls is that he might be able to keep them in the air for a while. But he can't get them down into the right box at the right time. Instead, he leaves the room and the juggled balls tumble down right into someone else's lap. In a meeting, he may very well start playing with his mobile phone or his computer, or will start chatting to the person beside him, softly at first, thinking that no one will notice anything. It's not true. Of course, everyone gets quite irritated. But if no one says anything, he'll just continue. Here Yellows are like little children. They are good at testing the limits. They continue until someone becomes too angry and puts his foot down. And, of course, then the Yellow feels hurt. He just wanted to. The way Yellows often quickly get bored can have far greater consequences than a little disruptive behavior during meetings. They're not good at everyday trivial things like administration and follow-ups. As usual, most Yellows would contest what I just wrote. In their own eyes, they are the masters even here. But if we consider the ability to follow up, this could be a serious threat to the effective implementation of a project. New project. Great. Put together a new and dynamic team full of interesting people. Check. Get everything going and develop ideas and concepts. Are you kidding? Already done that. Working like crazy in the beginning to really get things sped up. Yup. But then, following up on what is actually happening or not happening in a project is extremely boring. That means looking backwards. That's dull. And it won't happen. A Yellow can't keep his concentration long enough to follow through. He would rather persuade himself that it's important to have confidence in people and just trust that the project gets done. A funny example happened once when I coached sales reps at a large commercial TV channel. I sat with a female seller, a clever young woman who made big business deals. We had identified some weaknesses in her behavior profile. After she had struggled to convince me that even bad traits could be quite good, and now started to make a plan for how she would proceed in her personal development. It began to fall apart on the first point. When would she begin? She couldn't start that day because it was already past 3 in the afternoon. And tomorrow was full of meetings. It had to be next week. But she was away then. Maybe the week after that. She would check her calendar and see. She had lost the match before she had even begun. Me. Yellows aren't necessarily more selfish than others. But they always seem to be. Why? Mostly because of their dialogue. Since they primarily talk about themselves. And when other people are not sufficiently interesting and exciting, a Yellow will interrupt and guide the topic towards something far more interesting. Not infrequently himself. I remember a seller I encountered during a conference with a pharmaceutical company a few years ago. Gustav exhibited all of the less successful aspects of yellow behavior. And the problem was that he was completely unaware of it. He very rarely spoke about anything but himself and the things he had done. And he behaved as if he were the one who was leading the conference and not me. I have my methods to deal with those boys. But it's amusing to study them for a while before I adjust their behavior with a few choice words. During the first break, a few examples. Every time I put a question to the group, Gustav answered. His quick answers would have indicated engagement, if it had not been for the fact that he was often actually spewing nonsense. He simply said the things that popped into his head. He couldn't keep his thoughts in his own head. And everything just tumbled out. When I directed my attention to one of Gustav's colleagues instead of him, he simply leaned into my field of vision and continued talking. When I began directing questions to specific people in the room, simply calling them by name, Gustav answered anyway. Pretty impressive, right? He would speak for a while and then ask Sven. That's what you were going to say, right, Sven? Sven just shook his head. He was used to this. Gustav continued like that the whole morning before I could rein in him. He just charged in whenever there was a gap or a few seconds silence. He never allowed anyone to speak and everything he said was to be taken as gospel truth. He dominated the room without even thinking about the other 19 people. The funny thing was that everyone was aware of what was going on. But no one had the energy to stand up to Gustav. They just stared at me with slight desperation in their eyes, hoping that I had some way of silencing him. During lunch, he proclaimed far and wide, so that everyone heard it, that he thought the conference was going very well. By that point the majority of the group hated the very sound of his voice. They could barely put up with him. To save them from their suffering, I had to have a quick feedback intervention with him during the coffee break. Something you'll learn more about when I discuss giving feedback. You never told me that. I would remember. If a yellow is anything, it's a bad listener. They're really miserable at it. In point of fact, many yellows I have met say that they are very good listeners. And of course supplied entertaining examples of this undeniable fact. But maybe it could be their memory that was at fault. Basically, they believe that they listen very well. But somewhere along the way to the brain storage shelves whatever they heard simply gets lost. Poof. No. It's not about memory. It's about how a yellow is often uninterested in what others say because he knows he could say it so much better himself. He doesn't stay focused. He begins thinking about other things. Begins doing other things. He does not want to listen. He wants to talk. They're also quite childish in that they only like doing things that are enjoyable. If a statement or story or just a normal conversation is boring, then they close their ears. Of course, there's a remedy. Take a course in entertaining rhetoric. Then you may be able to keep your yellow friends, partners, or colleagues' attention. If you can present your message in a more amusing way, he'll at least remain seated a bit longer. Rhetoric isn't the art of talking but rather the art of getting others to listen. If you have a good friend whom at this stage you have identified as yellow, you know exactly what I'm talking about. In mid-sentence, he opens his mouth and starts talking about something completely different. Bad memory? No. You were simply being tedious. But truly, add a bad memory into the equation and we really are in trouble. Many truly successful people in society are often better listeners than the general average. They don't willingly talk as much as they listen. They already know what they know. And to learn more they simply have to hush up and hear what others are saying. It's a way to absorb new knowledge. This is something yellows need to understand better if they're not to be perceived as completely hopeless. or just stagnant in their personal development. They must, for example, listen to the message I have presented in this last section. If they refuse to take it in just because it is a difficult and possibly a boring message, they'll never learn anything. How green people are perceived, so what do others? Other colors. Think about greens. The picture is ambivalent. Besides the fact that they are considered pleasant, friendly, and caring, there are other opinions. A person who, out of fear of conflict, says yes but means no. How do you handle him? How do you know what he really thinks? Reds and yellows especially have problems with what I call the silent resistance. Remaining silent rather than speaking out. Certain greens, however, tend to tell the truth behind the back of the person concerned. Therefore, others can perceive a green as dishonest, even though their intention is only to avoid conflict. In general, greens always expect the worst and therefore tend to lie low. Then we have the green's inability to change. When a green understands the need for change but still says no thanks, that leads those closest to him to think that he is afraid of change. Stubborn, unconcerned, and indifferent. As usual, we are talking about perceptions. If we ask reds what they think about greens, there will be some heavy opinions. Pigheadedness will never be a virtue. What do you do with a person who never changes his views? Ever? Not even when the facts indicate that it's time to take a different path. How do you handle someone whose resolve to continue on the present course has completely taken over? The difference between greens and blues is that while a blue holds out for more facts about an issue, greens expect everything to simply blow over. Since they refuse to change their minds, they've made a decision about something and will not concede. Why? Because they don't usually do that. Think about it. It may have taken you your whole life to come to a particular opinion about the dangerous cholesterol in food, about space travel, or about Britney Spears. Suddenly this guy comes along and says that you should exchange your current opinion for his. It's not going to happen. The green is waiting for the right feeling to come over him before he makes any changes. If it doesn't, well, they're often rather patient. Let me tell you about a young man, the son in a family I've known very well for many years. This guy is reasonably good in school. His grades are okay. He has many pals. At the outset, I would like to point out that when we speak about young people, in this case a teenager, we must be careful. This isn't a fully developed behavior profile or character. Young people still have things to learn about life in general. All impressions are not definitive. So what's the problem? This young man has his own ideas about what is true and false. And wild horses couldn't get him to change his mind. It may be something he heard from a friend or something he saw on television or something he picked up in school. When this knowledge or idea, irrespective of its source, has been established in his consciousness, it can't be dislodged. It makes no difference how often his parents point out the facts or how tough they are when they present the evidence. His point of view is clear. It doesn't even matter if they point out the danger in this or that way of thinking. He persists in his belief. Think about it. You supply all the available facts. And the guy says that he understands. He agrees that it sounds logical. Other people could feasibly do it that way, with good results. But still, he's not prepared to change his point of view. Some people would call this pig-headedness. What's the reason for this? Excellent question. It may be a result of where he first got the information. If a friend says that you can earn just as much money collecting trash as a newly qualified doctor can earn, it doesn't really matter if it's true or not. If the same friend suggests that you can't be arrested for drunk driving if you drive your car after drinking 3 beers. Then this becomes the truth. Even if we, with all the facts at our disposal, know that this is simply not the case. If this guy is told that he'll get a terrific job if he just works a little harder at mathematics, it becomes true. If he got this info from his best mate, it simply has to be true. If a green trusts in a particular individual, that individual's word becomes law. This makes it easy to exploit greens, because they can be a little naive and gullible. And unfortunately, certain people take advantage of this fact. Sometimes this obstinacy becomes a strength. No doubt about that. But when those around them perceive it as pure pig-headedness, it can create problems. Why bother? Nothing is worth caring about, since greens rarely make the first move and almost always allow others to step up first. You can easily get the impression that a green is not especially interested or engaged. And often that's the case. He is more passive than he is active. And this has an impact on his behavior. Not much is going on there. And what does it really matter? If you stay at home, nothing can really go wrong then. Right? What greens fail to see is that most other people want to do things. They assume that everyone thinks as they do and stays on the sofa. They are satisfied with doing nothing. Anything that upsets this standpoint becomes a threat. The result? Even more passivity. On one occasion, I heard a red-yellow boss describe his employees as uninspired and uninterested in their work. It tormented him because no matter how hard he tried to entice and insist, they never left the starting block. He presented numerous ideas, some of which were very interesting. But nothing happened. It can be like that with greens. They recognize a good idea as quickly as anyone else. But, for example, while their red colleagues sprint off with the baton, a green just sits and waits. Often they're waiting for the right feeling to convince them of an idea's merit, and if that doesn't happen, well, they wouldn't do anything anyway. So they get what they want. Why not just wait and see if the urge to act goes away? This particular boss called in his employees and asked them how they viewed the business. He was worried about the evident lack of discernible commitment. A couple of the men, who were lower middle age, said straight out that they couldn't think of anything that was worth getting involved in. The boss became extremely frustrated. He tried everything but got virtually no reaction. This can also happen in a marriage. There are stereotypes for everything. Like that some women might be drawn to the strong, silent type. For example, nothing wrong with that. But after they're married and she realizes that this is all that he is, strong and silent, she may not be as happy. And when she makes plans and he says he doesn't care, she gets frustrated. And so she makes even bigger plans. And he clutches the armrests on his favorite recliner even harder. This is the paradox. The bigger the plans, the less likely it is that a green will commit. All he wants is peace and quiet. Here's an example. I've been writing fiction for 20 years and really hoped to become a published author one day. Everyone in the family knew this. Not that I made a huge deal out of it. But I didn't hide my ambitions either. One green close to me understood how important it was for me to succeed. I have repeatedly spoken about my dream, explaining how it would make me feel if I succeeded as an author of fiction. Yet this green never asked how my writing was going. Maybe a comment every 5 years that I shouldn't take things so seriously or I will only be disappointed. And when I said things like, "This year it will happen. Now is the time. Damn it. I've got to work harder to succeed," the response was, "Wow, that's a lot of work." Lots of work is a green's greatest enemy. Just because that's exactly what it is. Work. They live in a mindset that everything should be easy. This form of indifference and lack of commitment can kill the enthusiasm of even the most inspired person. I had to learn to rely on others to find the energy to struggle on with my writing. But a green doesn't understand this. He doesn't want people to be too involved, because it's just bothersome. Instead, let's just sit here and do nothing. What's thought in secret is said in secret. Greens are reluctant to take a position on sensitive issues. They have just as many views and opinions as anyone else. But they don't like shouting them from the rooftops. The reason is simple. It can cause a fuss. The consequence of this tendency is a rather abstruse manner of expressing themselves. Instead of saying, "That's impossible," they may respond with something like, "It appears that there are a few challenges in delivering that." Sure, both statements mean the same thing. We won't manage to do it in time. But by using a less direct means of expression, you take fewer risks. If you take a clear stance on something, then you have to stand up for it. For a green, it's better to be safe than sorry. By expressing himself ambiguously, he avoids taking responsibility for the matter in question. He doesn't have to risk his good name if he's uncertain. If he hasn't taken a position in support of something, he also hasn't taken any position against something. You hear how illogical this sounds, right? But if you're green, you know exactly what I mean. A woman I met once said that she believed what everyone else believed. But are greens perceived as unclear just because they want to save a relationship? No, not at all. Greens just aren't as precise as the other colors. When a red says that he absolutely hates listening to Eminem, a green would say that he remembers better singers. When a blue says that he has lost 5 pounds since last Tuesday morning at 10:03, a green says that he's lost a few pounds lately. This is because greens are not as task-oriented as reds and blues. Greens don't speak about facts in the same way. They would rather speak about relationships and feelings, which makes it more difficult to be precise. How do you measure a feeling? Saying, "I love you exactly 12% more than last month," is just not going to work. I know I should change this immediately, but I'll just think about it for a while. Here we have the most difficult stumbling block. If you want to make changes in a group consisting of many greens, good luck. If it's a major change, you should consider whether it's really worth the effort. If it's urgent, you can forget the whole thing. This is what happens in the mind of a green. I know what I have but not what I'll get. It was better before. I've never done this before. The grass is not always greener on the other side. Sound familiar? Sure, not all changes are for the better. But let's be reasonable. I'm not saying that it's always wrong to express these sentiments. But when changes are really necessary, it can be very dangerous. A classic cliché, a little worn now, I know, is to consider how often you change where you sit at the breakfast table. I used to ask this question in the groups I met. Many smiled and said that they sat where they usually sit because it just happened. Sure, I do the same thing sometimes. But if someone were to point out that I was stuck in a rigid habit or bad habit, I would do something about it. A green, however, doesn't correct himself. When you look at a green's reaction to the question, you'll understand that we're faced with a problem. I've seen adults become white in the face, wiping their foreheads at the mere thought of sitting on the other side of the table. I've even worked with a man, Sune, who had such a meticulous lunchtime routine that if he couldn't follow it precisely, the rest of his day was shrouded in sheer darkness. Sune had a favorite lunch spot beneath a painting. He sat there every day at lunchtime. Week in, week out, month out and year in. Always the same chair. If he came into the dining room and saw that his spot was occupied, he would stop short, If he saw this quickly enough, he'd turn towards his backup location. Not as good but still an acceptable spot. Near a window. If he were forced to have his soup there, he would glare throughout the meal at whoever had nicked his spot. Of course, he never said anything. Instead, he just sulked the rest of the day. This is another thing Greens often do. Turn frustration inwards and feel awful so that everyone notices it. If Sune's backup spot was also occupied, he would just go back into the kitchen. The rest of his day ruined. Let me give you another example. My mother, departed but never forgotten. We'll never stop loving you. Our darling mother, who was nothing if not green, was always willing to help and took care of her grandchildren whenever needed. Especially when they were little. I remember one time when my wife and I were invited to dinner on a Friday night. I had asked my mother to watch the kids weeks in advance because I knew that she needed time to mentally prepare herself for it. On the day the dinner was to take place, the hostess called. Her husband was sick, and the whole thing was postponed. When I phoned my mum, I explained to her what had happened. We would be staying home that night. She went completely silent. I said that I still wanted her to come over because the children were excited to see their grandma. Mum was very hesitant. What will happen now? She asked. I said that it would be just like we had planned originally. Because her bag was packed and the guest room was ready. It would be a perfect opportunity to spend a little time together. She hesitated. It will be completely different now. You're at home. She was flustered by the change. And she needed time to think. She promised to phone back. What was really Mum's problem? Our change of plans necessitated no change for her at all. She was still going to stay overnight between Friday and Saturday. She could still see her grandchildren. She would, however, avoid having any responsibility for them. I tried to convince her that we could take care of her for once, instead of her taking care of us. This was a completely new situation for her. We were still there in the house. And that was the problem. My wife and I would be there. Maybe Mum had her heart set on watching a particular show on television. Maybe she had thought about preparing a special meal for the children. Maybe. I don't know. She never said anything about it. So we can't know for sure. But the change was serious enough to warrant extra thinking time for her. She came in the end. A nice little side story. Quite possibly related to her generation. I fetched her at 4:30. She asked why I came so late. I replied that I had promised to be there at 5 o'clock and that I was actually half an hour early. Her response? She'd been ready since 4 o'clock. I've never been so upset. But for God's sake, don't say anything to anyone. This is the second major dilemma with green behavior. They despise a squabble. This aversion to conflict also causes many other challenges, such as stubbornness, ambiguity, and resistance to change. Because Greens are pronounced relational people, nothing is more important to them than keeping a relationship together. The problem is that their method doesn't work. You can look at conflicts in two ways. The first way is called the harmony outlook, or striving for harmony. Everything depends on being on good terms with others. Reaching an agreement is an end in itself. This means that those who cause conflict are problematic troublemakers. Conflicts are indicative of poor leadership, poor communication, and discord. And so we smother conflict and pretend that it doesn't exist because who wants to be acquainted with a troublemaker? I once met a coach who used an interesting metaphor for this kind of behavior. She said it was like sitting at the dinner table with a rotting pile of trash in the middle. You know, with mold and flies and everything. Everyone sees that the trash is there. But no one says anything. You brush away the flies and pass the food across the liquefying banana peels without thinking anything about it. Maybe by the end someone wonders if there even really is a pile of trash on the table at all. Finally, one of the dinner table guests says, "We have to do something about this." That person becomes an agitator. Because we now have to deal with this nasty mess of garbage. Couldn't she have just kept quiet? Nowadays we know better. The aspiration of having everyone in agreement about everything all the time is an impossible utopia. Not even worth trying to achieve. Someone will lift the lid off all that discord that was so effectively and hermetically sealed for such a long period of time. And what happens then? It stinks from a long way off. In the end, the harmony outlook inevitably leads to conflict. The second way, and the opposite to the first, is called the conflict outlook. It basically means that we accept that conflicts exist. That it's natural. No group exists where everyone is always in agreement about everything. The whole point of the conflict outlook is to deal with every little dissentient issue as soon as it shows its head. Reds, and also some yellows, do this naturally. When they see something that doesn't work, they say that it doesn't work. This means that problems can be resolved at an early stage. But you have to deal with the issue before it begins to stink. The conflict approach usually creates harmony. But a green will just turn a deaf ear. He'll do everything in his power to maintain that magical feeling that everyone is in agreement. It's nicer when everyone agrees. Isn't it? Wouldn't the world be so much better if there were no conflicts? Consider a situation all of us have experienced at some point. We're in a meeting at work. There are maybe 10 people present in the room. Add or subtract from this so that you recognize the situation. Someone, the boss or anyone at all, has just completed his presentation and now asks what everyone is thinking. Full of expectation, he looks around, waiting for feedback. If there are any reds or yellows in the room, they will speak about their views on the proposal they've just seen. The reds will love it or loathe it. The yellows will speak about their own reflections on the proposal. One or two blues might have a few questions. What do the greens do? Absolutely nothing. They just lean back in their chairs and let themselves absorb the proposal. They say nothing at all unless asked a direct question. They look anxiously around, hoping that someone will say that this proposal is, in fact, an incomprehensible mess. The group is too large for them to trot out any dissenting opinions. To say something truly dramatic or negative would mean that everyone's eyes will be on you. And that's not going to happen. If they say what they are really thinking, a heated debate will erupt. And since a green doesn't want to take part in heated debates, he doesn't even want to be in the same room as one. He simply keeps silent. How will the speaker respond? He'll assume that everyone is in agreement. Right? What he doesn't know is that half the people in the room think it was the stupidest thing they have ever heard. When the truth creeps out, it has to, sooner or later. Guess what happens then? Exactly. Conflict. You can be certain that while you are standing at the coffee machine and maybe even while visiting the restroom, the truth will come out. When greens need to relieve the pressure of not speaking out, they talk behind your back. In small groups of 2 or 3 people, they will gladly vent their displeasure. And they're good at it. As long as they think they can escape your gaze, they'll backbite you in ways you would never expect from a green. How blue people are perceived. Even perfectionist blue individuals receive criticism. It can be about how they are perceived as evasive, defensive, perfectionist, reserved, fastidious, meticulous, hesitant, conservative, lacking independence, questioning, suspicious, tedious, aloof, and cold-hearted. off. The list of shortcomings found in these bastions of bureaucracy often tends to be quite long. But mainly, blues find it difficult to begin anything new because they want to prepare very thoroughly. Everything involves risks, and blues can be almost obsessed with details. Never place too many blues in the same group. They'll plan into the next century without ever putting a shovel to the ground. Furthermore, many blues are perceived as highly critical and almost suspicious. They miss nothing, and they have a tendency to deliver their observations in an insensitive fashion. They create quality work, but their hair-splitting, critical approach to almost everything lowers the morale of those around them to dangerously low levels. These are people who consider themselves to be realists, when they, in everyone else's eyes, are, in fact, pessimists. 95% right is actually 100% wrong. Let's be honest from the start. All this keeping track of facts and focusing on details can go too far. There are limits to when it's reasonable to keep researching. Do you remember the CEO who wanted to buy leadership training? He never left the starting block. Blues want to have all the information on everything. And this can lead to problems with those around them. People who would be satisfied with good enough simply can't cope with hearing all those questions. And all this relentless poking into details. A blue believes that good enough is never really good enough. I enjoy working around the house, changing the decor, hanging wallpaper every now and then. A few years ago, we remodeled our kitchen, and even though I got tremendous help from my family, I did quite a lot myself. I worked and toiled and was quite happy when it was finished. For a year, I thought I managed it quite well. Hans, a good friend of mine, came by. We've known each other for many years. And he's very much on the ball. He knew that I'd worked very hard and that I felt quite pleased with myself. When he came into my kitchen, he looked around and said quietly, "New kitchen? Looks good. That cupboard door is crooked." Okay, so maybe it wasn't nice to hear that. But for Hans, it was the highest form of logic. He observed a mistake and his sense of perfection meant that he couldn't ignore it. Besides, he is not a typical relational person. So he couldn't help saying things as they were. He wasn't directly criticizing me. Only something I had done. Namely, not fitting the cupboard door straight. Fastidiousness can be expressed in various ways. It can be a person who can't cope with papers that aren't perfectly aligned on a desk. Who rewrites an email about 15 times to get it truly perfect. Or who works for hours on a simple Excel spreadsheet or PowerPoint presentation. Just giving it the finishing touches. They never finish anything. There's always more to do. Once, I was holding a communication training program for a group of people, all of who were working in the same room. The group consisted of about 20 people. The first afternoon, I handed out the results of the behavior analysis that each of them had taken earlier. Everyone read about themselves with increasing fascination. And most of them seemed very satisfied. Except for one lady. She was extremely upset by her analysis. It was, in fact, completely incorrect. After confirming with her that it was okay to discuss it in front of the whole group, I asked what it was she was displeased with. "There's so much that's incorrect," she told us. For example, the analysis revealed that she could be a perfectionist. She wasn't like that at all. I noticed the tiny smiles appearing on people's faces. Apparently, her colleagues knew something she didn't. I asked her why she thought that the analysis maintained she was a perfectionist. She had no idea. The whole thing was a complete mystery. It was a totally useless tool. Realizing that the woman was blue, I was careful not to argue too much. She wouldn't take me at my word. I was just some random consultant who had been working with this tool for a measly 20 years. What did I know? Instead, I asked her to give an example showing that she was not a perfectionist, no problem. She had plenty. For example, she had 3 children, each of who had 3 best pals. When she came home in the evenings, there were so many shoes piled up inside the front door that she had to do the high jump to get in. She began by shaking the dirt off the doormat and putting the shoes in order. She confided in me that she used to put size 10 at the back, as those guys went home last. So it seemed most logical. She placed the smaller sizes closest to the door in neat rows. Then she went into the kitchen. What did she see there? Crumbs everywhere. All of these youngsters had been eating sandwiches. And the kitchen looked like a war zone. It took her 20 minutes to sanitize everything. Put everything back in place. Sweep. Wipe the tables and worktops. Only then could she take off her coat and relax a little. Her colleagues were in stitches. The woman looked around, not understanding what the excitement was all about. That any of this could even be remotely obsessive was beyond her. Her house was so untidy. That was her point. The funny thing about this story is that a few years later I met the same woman but in a totally different context. She gave me a big hug and said that the analysis of her behavior was 100% correct. Stunned, I wondered how she arrived at that conclusion. It turned out that she had kept the behavior profile in her purse for a while. The analysis had a list of behaviors and qualities. And every time she found herself doing one, she ticked it off on the sheet. In the end, she had ticked all of them off. She liked the profile. An amazing tool. On the whole, I don't really know you. So keep your distance. You've done it. I've done it. We've all done it. Gone up to a person who seems to be a decent fellow and started talking about this and that. Thinking you're going to have a nice chat. After a while, you realize that you're the one doing all the talking. If you have yellow traits in your behavior, you may notice that there are strange pauses in the dialogue. If there really is a dialogue, you may notice that the other person fidgets a bit, signaling that he doesn't want to be part of this conversation. What's going on? We're just talking about the game yesterday. Or about what the family did last summer. Or where you intend to go on vacation. Do we have a problem? Or what? Quote, yes. In fact we do. Because this person doesn't willingly speak with strangers. Wait a minute, you may say. We've been working together for 3 months. And by now it should be perfectly okay to ask what his dog's name is. But this guy requires a lot of personal space, both physically and psychologically. He needs to know a person extremely well before opening up. Not like a red, who lets out with whatever he feels. Not like a yellow, who reveals his darkest secrets because he assumes that everyone is interested. Or like a green, who can be personal, but only in small groups and in a controlled environment. A blue doesn't need small talk. He can easily give the impression that he doesn't care about other people. Because he doesn't cultivate any relationships. Sure, he cares. But his needs are on a different level than everyone else's. He likes being in his own company and with immediate family. The consequence is clear for those around him. They find him cold-hearted and distant. That personal bubble is obvious. And it can be very chilly. Particularly for yellows and greens. And so they call their blue friend a bore. Blues can easily make us feel ill at ease. Why is he so cold and dismissive? Doesn't he care about me at all? Quote, better safe than sorry. Think about it. Preferably 3 times. A good family friend couldn't leave her house without first checking to see if her keys were really in her handbag. Even though placing them there was the last thing she had done before going to the front door. Back in the 1980s, when I worked as a teller in the bank, I served people who had waited 30 minutes in line for just one single reason: to check that the balance printed on the ATM receipt really was correct. Much anticipation. The same computer. The same balance. But you never know. Best to check. And double check. If a triple check had been possible, they would have done it. Where does this need for control come from? Why can't Blues trust what other people say or just accept the information they hear? Answer: they can. Of course. But if they also check themselves, then all the risks will be eliminated. Right? But the fact remains that they don't trust others. Everything has to be confirmed, and recorded, and documented properly. Remember, we're talking here about behavior as perceived by others. A Blue checks everything one extra time because it's possible to check everything one extra time. When everything has been confirmed, then you just have to make a decision. I have a good friend who uses Excel diligently, but not like the rest of us. This guy has a special method. He writes a formula and inserts all the data before he sends any important files to his senior managers.